Welcome, we're so happy you tuned in tonight. Before we get started, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Now, let's get comfortable and drift into deep, peaceful sleep together. The next story is about to begin, please relax and enjoy. The aurora blazed across the Los Angeles sky like digital fire, streaks of green and violet that shouldn't have existed this far south. Ethan Reyes adjusted his jury-rigged VR headset one more time, the solar panels he'd grafted onto its sides catching the last rays of October sunlight filtering through the eucalyptus trees of Griffith Park. His phone was propped against a rock, live streaming to maybe 12 people who cared about his quantum gaming revolution project. "Okay, chat, we're about to push this thing to 11, he said, voice crackling with nervous energy. Solar batteries at 96%. Geomagnetic readings are off the charts, and he squinted at his smartwatch. Holy shit. The magnetometer's going crazy. This storm's hitting harder than predicted. The headset's weight felt familiar on his skull, cables snaking down to the makeshift battery pack at his waist. Months of salvaged electronics, YouTube tutorials, and stubborn determination had led to this moment. While his classmates were grinding through senior year applications, Ethan was trying to crack the code of consciousness itself, or at least build something cool enough to go viral. Initiating full-spectrum neural mapping in 3, 2... The world exploded into kaleidoscopic fragments. Colours that had no names shrieked across his vision as every nerve ending caught fire. The aurora above seemed to reach down with crackling fingers, and Ethan felt himself falling through dimensions of light and time, his scream lost in a cosmic wind that tasted of ozone and eternity, then darkness, then cold, then the gentle slap of waves against his face. Ethan's eyes fluttered open to find himself sprawled on wet sand beneath a canopy of unfamiliar stars. The aurora was gone, replaced by a moon so bright it cast sharp shadows across pristine beach. His VR headset lay in pieces nearby, circuits still sparking feebly. The air smelled of salt and rotting seaweed, but underneath that was something else, an absence of the petroleum and exhaust that always lingered in LA's atmosphere. His smartwatch face was cracked but still functional, showing 11:47 p.m. The date read October 15th, but the year display flickered between 2020 and something impossible, 1716. What the actual... Well, what have we here? Ethan jerked upright to find 3 men standing over him, their silhouettes outlined against the star-drunk sky. Tricorn hats, loose-fitting shirts, and the unmistakable glint of cutlass steel. His brain, still reeling from whatever had happened, tried to process this information and failed spectacularly. "Looks like a survivor from that sloop we spotted breaking up on the reef," said one of them, his voice carrying a strange accent. Part English, part something Caribbean. Fancy clothes, though, silk by the feel of it. Another man, broader and more scarred, spat into the sand near Ethan's feet. Could be Spanish, could be valuable, could be trouble. Only one way to find out. The third man, younger than the others, extended a hand. "On your feet, lad. Captain'll want words with you." Ethan's hand moved instinctively to his phone, but found only empty pocket. He looked around frantically until he spotted it half buried in sand, its cracked screen dark. When he reached for it, the youngest pirate, because these were definitely pirates, his mind finally admitted, grabbed his wrist. "Careful now. What's this curious thing?" The man lifted the phone, turning it over in his hands. "Some manner of spyglass? The craftsmanship is peculiar. It's, Ethan's voice cracked. "It's a navigation device. Very advanced. Very expensive." The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "You speak strangely, boy. Where are you from?" Before Ethan could concoct an answer, torchlight flickered through the palm trees behind them. More voices, more footsteps. The beach suddenly felt very small and very exposed. "Silas, Tomas, what's the delay?" The voice that cut through the night air belonged to a woman, commanding and sharp. "The tide turns in an hour, and I'll not have the stormcrow caught in these shallows because you 3 decided to play with beach refuse." The woman who emerged from the tree line stood barely 5.5 feet tall, but carried herself like she owned every grain of sand beneath her boots. Dark hair was braided with bits of bone and coloured thread, and her coat, a deep blue thing that might once have belonged to a naval officer, hung open to reveal a brace of pistols across her chest. Most striking were her eyes, pale green and sharp enough to cut glass. "Captain Vane," said the youngest pirate, Thomas. "Found this one washed up with wreckage from that Dutch sloop. Claims his bauble here is some sort of navigation aid." Captain Vane's gaze moved from Ethan's face to his clothes. The synthetic fibres of his gaming hoodie, the complex weave of his jeans, the rubber soles of his sneakers. Her expression shifted from annoyance to curiosity. "Navigation, you say?" She plucked the phone from Tomas's grip and examined it more closely. The glass is remarkably clear. The craftsmanship ... She looked up at Ethan. "What's your name, boy?" "Ethan? Ethan Reyes. Spanish blood, then. But your accent." She circled him slowly, predator-like. "Where did you learn to speak English so cleanly? And where did you acquire clothes of such unusual make?" Ethan's mind raced. He'd read enough fantasy novels to know that claiming to be from the future was a quick path to accusations of madness or sorcery. Neither seemed like good career moves when surrounded by armed pirates. "I'm a scholar," he said carefully, "from a distant university. I was aboard a research vessel studying celestial navigation when the storm hit." "A scholar." Captain Vane's smile was sharp. "How fortunate. The Stormcrow has need of men with learning." She turned to the scarred pirate. "Silas, what think you?" Silas spat again. "I think he's too clean to have been in any shipwreck, and his kit's too fine for any honest scholar. Could be a spy, could be bait. Either way, he's trouble we don't need. Perhaps, or perhaps he's exactly what fate has provided." Vane handed the phone back to Ethan. "Tell me, scholar, can you read the stars?" Ethan glanced up at the alien constellations above them. But they weren't alien, he realised. They were simply the same stars he'd known all his life, viewed from a different latitude and without the light pollution of modern civilization. The Big Dipper hung low on the horizon, and Polaris glittered like a diamond in the north. "Yes," he said, "I can read them. And can you chart a course by them?" This was dangerous territory. Ethan knew the basics of celestial navigation from astronomy classes and Wikipedia binges, but theory and practice were very different things. Still, it seemed like his best chance of not ending up as shark food. With the proper instruments, yes. Captain Vane studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, Ethan Reyes. You'll come aboard the Stormcrow as our navigator, prove useful, and you'll earn your share like any other member of my crew. Prove otherwise." She let the implication hang in the salt air. "What if I refuse? Then Silas gets his wish, and you remain here on this beach, permanently." Her hand rested casually on the butt of one pistol. "The choice is yours, scholar." Ethan looked around at the empty beach, then at the dense jungle beyond. He had no idea where he was, when he was, or how he'd gotten here. But these people had a ship, which meant they had food, water, and most importantly, mobility. His best chance of figuring out what had happened, and how to get home, lay with them. "I accept." The Stormcrow proved to be a sleek brigantine anchored in a sheltered cove, her twin masts rising like spears against the starfield. As the longboat approached her hull, Ethan could make out carved decorations along her rails and the gleam of bronze cannons in her ports. She was beautiful in the way that all dangerous things were beautiful. Elegant, deadly, and utterly unforgiving of mistakes. The next weeks passed in a blur of rope burns, seasickness, and hard-won education in the realities of 18th century piracy. Thomas, despite being only 11 years old, proved an invaluable guide to shipboard life. The boy had grown up on these decks after being orphaned in Port Royal, and his quick wit and street-smart humour made him Ethan's first real friend among the crew. "Keep your head down, speak when spoken to, and never show fear," Thomas whispered, as he taught Ethan to tie proper knots. "Captain Vane's fair but hard. She'll give you every chance to prove yourself, but cross her or show cowardice, and you'll find yourself swimming home." Dr. Adelina Montserrat, the ship's surgeon, presented a different challenge. A woman in her late 20s with intelligent dark eyes and steady hands, she watched Ethan with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Her medical knowledge was impressive for the era, but when Ethan carelessly mentioned the concept of antiseptics during a conversation about treating wounds, her interest became almost predatory. "You speak of invisible creatures that cause infection," she said one evening as she tended to a sailor's infected cut. "This is not theory I have encountered in any medical text. It's a new idea, from the universities in the north." Ethan watched as she cleaned the wound with rum, wincing at the waste of good alcohol. "Have you ever noticed that wounds heal better when cleaned with spirits? rather than water alone. I have observed this, yes, but you suggest there is a reason beyond the spirit's heat. What if I told you that bread mould, when properly prepared, could fight infection more effectively than any spirit? Adelina's eyebrows rose. I would say you're either a genius or a madman, possibly both. It was during their third week at sea that Ethan's modern knowledge proved its worth in dramatic fashion. He was on night watch, using his smartwatch's digital compass and star chart app, carefully hidden from view to verify their position, when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The constellation of Cassiopeia hung too low on the horizon. Combined with the Southern Cross's position, it meant they were sailing directly toward a reef system that wasn't marked on any of their charts. "Captain!" Ethan's shout brought Vane running from her cabin, half-dressed and fully armed. "Hard to starboard. There's a reef directly ahead." "I see no reef," Silas growled from the helm. "The water's deep here, boy. Check your instruments." "Trust me." Ethan pointed at the subtle change in wave patterns barely visible in the moonlight. "The waves are breaking differently. There's something large and shallow about 200 yards ahead." Captain Vane studied the water for a heartbeat, then bellowed, "All hands! Hard to starboard! Drop anchor when I give the word." The Stormcrow heeled over as her crew threw their weight into the turn. 30 seconds later, the lookout's cry confirmed Ethan's warning. Reef to port. Damn near took her belly out. That night, as the crew celebrated their narrow escape with an extra ration of rum, Captain Vane approached Ethan at the bow rail. "Your eyes are sharper than any man's I've known," she said quietly, "and your knowledge of star paths runs deeper than most. Tell me true, what are you running from, Ethan Reyes?" "Why do you assume I'm running from something?" "Because men don't join pirate crews out of wanderlust. They join because the life they left behind offers them nothing, or because staying would mean death." Her pale eyes reflected starlight. "Which is it for you?" Ethan considered telling her the truth. The whole impossible truth. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he said, "I'm looking for something. Something I lost." "What manner of thing?" "The way home." Vane nodded slowly. "Aye, that's something we're all seeking one way or another." She turned to go, then paused. "The crew respects you now. You've earned that. Don't squander it." Their first raid came 2 days later, when they intercepted a Dutch merchant vessel heavy with sugar and silver from the Caribbean colonies. Ethan had hoped to avoid the violence, to somehow remain a non-combatant, but Captain Vane made it clear that every member of her crew fought when fighting was required. "A ship is only as strong as her weakest link," she told him, as the crew prepared for battle. "If you won't fight beside us, you're not one of us. And if you're not one of us..." The boarding action was brief and brutal. Ethan found himself swept along by the tide of screaming pirates, cutlass in hand, too terrified to do anything but swing when someone swung at him. The Dutch crew surrendered quickly, but not before Ethan had seen men die, really die, with blood and screams and the terrible finality of stopped hearts. In the aftermath, as the crew divided the spoils, Ethan made a discovery that changed everything. In the merchant captain's cabin, hidden beneath a false bottom in a chest of navigation instruments, he found half of something that made his smartwatch's sensors go haywire. It was jade, carved in intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the lamplight. Metallic veins ran through the stone. Magnetite, he realized, remembering his physics classes. When he held it close to his watch, the device's magnetic field sensors spiked, and for just a moment, the cracked screen flickered with readings that defied logic. "Temporal displacement detected," scrolled across the display before it went dark again. "Quantum signature match, 94%. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. This thing, whatever it was connected to what had happened to him, connected to the Aurora, to the impossible rift that had torn him from 2020 and dumped him in 1716. "Ah, you've found my little treasure." Ethan spun to find Captain Vane watching from the cabin doorway, her expression unreadable. "This is yours?" "Now it is. Took it from a Spanish treasure ship 3 months past, along with the other half." She produced a matching piece of jade from beneath her coat. The Spanish captain said it was an Aztec artifact, combined with Chinese astronomical knowledge, called it the Jade Astrolabe. When the two halves were brought together, they formed a perfect sphere covered in intricate carvings, symbols that looked like star maps mixed with mathematical formulas, and threading through it all were those metallic veins that made Ethan's watch go berserk. There was writing with it, Vane continued, a prophecy of sorts. When the starborn child comes to mend the sky at Dragon Gate, twin suns shall writhe and heaven's door shall open. Poetic nonsense, I thought. But now... She looked at Ethan meaningfully. Now I wonder... Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion on deck. Silas burst into the cabin, his scarred face twisted with anger. "Captain, we have a problem. That merchant vessel we took, she was flying Dutch colours, but her papers mark her as English. We've just robbed a ship under Crown protection." Vane's jaw tightened. "How certain are you?" "Certain enough. And certain that Commodore Nathaniel Hawke of His Majesty's Navy will be hunting us within the week. He's been stalking these waters for months, looking for any excuse to put a noose around your neck." The name seemed to hit Captain Vane like a physical blow. Her hand went instinctively to a scar along her collarbone, and her eyes hardened. "Hawke," she whispered. "Then we run. Set course for Tortuga. We need information, supplies, and a place to lay low while we plan our next move." Tortuga proved to be everything Ethan had imagined and worse. The infamous pirate haven was a sprawling collection of ramshackle buildings, taverns that never closed, and people who asked no questions as long as your silver was good. The air reeked of unwashed bodies, cheap rum and moral decay. It was there, in a tavern called the Laughing Skull, that they met the cartographer who would change everything. He was an ancient man, skin like leather and eyes clouded with cataracts, but his hands were steady as he examined the jade astrolabe by flickering candlelight. "I know this device," he wheezed. "Seen its like once before in the hands of a Chinese explorer who claimed it could open doors between the world of the living and the realm of spirits." He traced the carved symbols with one gnarled finger. "But this one's different, more complex. The star patterns..." He looked up sharply at Ethan. "You understand astronomy, young man?" "Some." "Then you'll know these aren't random decorations. They're a star map, showing the positions of celestial bodies during events of great magnetic disturbance. Solar storms, they call them in the Chinese texts, when the sun's fire reaches out to touch the earth." Ethan's pulse quickened. "And Dragon Gate?" The old man's smile was gap-toothed and knowing. "A place where the earth's magnetic field runs strange, where compasses spin like dancers and the northern lights sometimes touch the water. The Spanish call it El Triángulo del Diablo. Your people might know it by another name." The Bermuda Triangle. Ethan's blood turned to ice water. He was talking about the Bermuda Triangle, that legendary region where ships and planes disappeared without trace. And if the prophecy was right, if the astrolabe could somehow open heaven's door during a solar storm... "How far to Dragon Gate?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. 3 days hard sailing to the northeast, but you'll not want to go there, lad. Ships that enter those waters during the aurora storms, they don't come back." That night, as the crew slept off their shore leave, Ethan found Captain Vane standing at the Stormcrow's bow rail, staring out at the star-drunk Caribbean sky. "You're planning to sail for Dragon Gate," he said. It wasn't a question. "Aye. The prophecy speaks of a starborn child who will mend the sky. You arrive from nowhere, speaking strangely, dressed in clothes no tailor on earth has made, carrying devices that confound our understanding." She turned to face him. "Tell me true, Ethan Reyes. Are you that child?" Ethan looked into her pale green eyes and made a decision that would doom them all. "Yes," he said. "I am." The next morning brought news that chilled everyone's blood. Thomas had gone ashore the previous evening and failed to return. Search parties found him in the custody of local authorities, arrested for brawling with British sailors. But the circumstances were suspicious. Witnesses claimed the British had started the fight, and that Thomas had been targeted specifically. "It's a trap," Silas growled as they gathered in Vane's cabin to plan a rescue. "Hawke's here, or his agents are. They're using the boy as bait." "Then we give them what they expect," Vane replied. "We walk into their trap, but we do it on our terms." The rescue mission that followed became the stuff of legend among the Tortuga taverns. Ethan, driven by guilt and desperate to save his young friend, proposed a plan that seemed insane, but just might work. Using his knowledge of chemistry and the ship's store of gunpowder, he improvised a series of flashbang explosives that would disorient their enemies long enough for a swift extraction. The plan worked perfectly until it didn't. They freed Thomas and were fighting their way back to the harbour when British Marines appeared from concealment, cutting off their escape route. In the running battle that followed, Ethan found himself fighting alongside Captain Vane, his modern reflexes and unpredictable tactics proving surprisingly effective against trained military opponents. It was during that fight that he saw her true nature for the first time. Arabella Vane wasn't just a pirate captain, she was a force of nature, moving through combat with lethal grace, every shot perfectly placed, every sword stroke economical and deadly. But there was something else in her eyes as she fought, something that looked almost like joy. They made it back to the Storm Crow and escaped into open water, but not before Ethan caught a glimpse of their pursuer. Commodore Nathaniel Hawke stood on the dock watching their departure, and even at a distance Ethan could see the cold intelligence in the man's pale eyes. This was no ordinary naval officer. This was a hunter who had found his prey. "He'll follow us," Vane said as Tortuga fell behind them. "Hawke's lost too much to pirates to let us slip away again. He'll dog our wake until one of us is dead." "What did you take from him?" Ethan asked. Vane's hand went to her collarbone scar again. His brother, 3 years ago, off the coast of Jamaica. Young Lieutenant Hawke, fresh from England and full of righteous fire. He died with a sword in his hand and my blade in his heart. That night, as they sailed toward the mysterious waters of Dragon Gate, Ethan told Captain Vane the truth. All of it. The time travel, the quantum rift, his desperate need to return to 2020. He expected disbelief, mockery, perhaps accusations of madness. Instead, she listened in thoughtful silence, occasionally asking technical questions that demonstrated a sharp understanding of both navigation and natural philosophy. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "The aurora that night you arrived," she said finally. "I've sailed these waters for 10 years, and I've never seen lights like that so far south. And your devices, your knowledge of star paths we've never charted." She nodded slowly. I believe you. The question now is what we do with this knowledge. We use the astrolabe. We wait for another solar storm and we open the rift. And then I go home." Ethan met her eyes. "And you become legend." The next 2 days passed in a strange atmosphere of anticipation and dread. The crew sensed that something momentous was approaching, but only a handful knew the full truth. Dr. Montserrat had been brought into their confidence, and her scientific mind had seized on the implications with fierce enthusiasm. "If what you describe is true," she told Ethan, as they prepared the astrolabe, "then we are about to witness the greatest natural phenomenon in human history. The practical applications alone." Her eyes shone with possibilities. The medical knowledge you've shared, the concept of bacterial infection, the potential of bread mold as an antiseptic. This could save thousands of lives. "We'll save thousands of lives," Ethan corrected, "in about 300 years. They reached Dragon Gate on the morning of the 3rd day, sailing into waters that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly quality. Compasses began spinning wildly, and several crew members reported feeling strange tingles in their extremities. Ethan's smartwatch, which had been mostly dormant since his arrival, suddenly blazed to life with readings that defied explanation. "Magnetic anomaly detected," scrolled across its cracked screen. "Temporal field fluctuation imminent. Quantum cascade event probable." "How long?" Captain Vane asked, reading over his shoulder. "Soon. The solar storm's building. Look at the horizon." To the north, the sky was beginning to take on an unnatural hue, green and violet threads dancing between the clouds. Aurora Borealis, impossibly far south, painting the Caribbean sky with colours that belonged to the Arctic. It was then that Commodore Hawke's frigate appeared on the southern horizon, her white sails cutting through the afternoon heat like knife blades. But she wasn't alone. Another ship sailed alongside her, flying familiar colours. "Christ's blood," Silas breathed. "That's the Storm Crow." He was right. Impossibly, there were now 2 Storm Crows sailing these waters, the one they stood on, and another approaching from the south under the guns of Hawke's frigate. "Temporal echo," Ethan whispered. "The rift's already beginning to form. We're seeing ourselves from another timeline, another possibility." But even as he spoke, he realised the truth was worse than that. The second Storm Crow flew different colours, not the black flag of piracy, but the red banner of mutiny. Silas had finally made his move, seizing control of the ship and delivering it to Hawke in exchange for a royal pardon. "All hands, prepare for battle!" Vane's voice carried across the deck like a clarion call. "Mr. Crow has shown his true colours at last, but we'll not go gentle into that good night." The battle that followed defied every convention of naval warfare. 3 ships manoeuvred through waters that seemed to twist space itself, while overhead the aurora grew stronger, casting eerie light across the scene. Ethan climbed the mainmast with the Jade astrolabe, trying to align its intricate mechanisms with the growing magnetic storm above. Cannon fire thundered across the water as the 2 Stormcrows engaged each other in a battle that was both real and impossible. Ethan could see Silas on the deck of the other ship, bellowing orders to crew members who should have been standing right beside him. The paradox was tearing reality apart at the seams. "Now, Ethan," Captain Vane's voice cut through the chaos. "Whatever you're going to do it now." Above them, the aurora had become a writhing mass of energy that seemed to reach down toward the sea. Lightning crackled between the masts of all 3 ships, and the water itself began to glow with phosphorescent fire. Ethan pressed the 2 halves of the astrolabe together and felt power surge through the device like a living thing. The jade sphere began to spin in his hands, its carved symbols blazing with inner light. The metallic veins that ran through it sparked and danced, and suddenly the air around him tore open like fabric. Through the rift, Ethan could see Griffith Park in 2020. His own world, his own time, calling to him across centuries. The portal pulsed with every heartbeat, and he knew that if he was going to go, it had to be now. But as he prepared to leap through, he looked down at the deck of the Stormcrow and saw his friends fighting for their lives. Thomas, barely 11 years old, standing back to back with Dr. Montserrat as they faced Hawk's Marines. Captain Vane, blood streaming from a wound on her forehead, still fighting with the fury of a hurricane given human form. He could save himself. He could go home. All he had to do was jump. Instead, Ethan Reyes made the decision that would echo through legend for centuries to come. He twisted the astrolabe's mechanisms, not to stabilize the portal, but to redirect its energy. The rift that had opened to 2020 collapsed, but in its place, new doorways tore open across the battlefield. Commodore Hawk's frigate, caught in the dimensional crossfire, vanished into a swirling vortex that deposited it in the middle of the Sahara Desert, circa 1543. The mutinous Stormcrow, along with Silas and his treacherous crew, fell through a rift that led to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, but in the year 2157. The energy backlash sent Ethan tumbling from the mast into the churning waters below. As he fell, he felt Captain Vane's ring, a simple band of gold set with a single emerald, pressed into his palm. "Remember us," her voice followed him into the dark water. "Remember that we were here." The last thing Ethan saw before the portal collapsed was Arabella Vane standing at the rail of the Stormcrow, her pale green eyes bright with tears and laughter, watching him disappear into the space between moments. He woke up in Griffith Park, lying in a crater of scorched earth, with his ruined VR headset still smoking beside him. The aurora was fading from the sky, and his phone, miraculously intact, showed 11:48 p.m, October 15th, 2020. Only 1 minute had passed since the accident, but in his hand he held Captain Vane's ring, and embedded in the VR headset circuitry was a fragment of jade that pulsed with inner light. Over the following weeks, Ethan threw himself into research with the desperate intensity of a man trying to prove he wasn't insane. He studied astrophysics, quantum mechanics and temporal theory, looking for any scientific explanation for what had happened to him. The jade fragment resisted all attempts at analysis, but his smartwatch had recorded enough data to suggest that his impossible journey had actually occurred. The final proof came 2 months later, when he was visiting the Natural History Museum downtown. In a new exhibit on colonial Caribbean artifacts, he found a display case containing a gold ring set with an emerald dated to approximately 1720. The placard read, "Ring of Unknown Origin, discovered in the personal effects of the notorious pirate captain known as Grim, Arabella Vane." According to contemporary accounts, Captain Vane claimed the ring was a gift from a starborn navigator who saved her crew from destruction. Historians consider this claim to be typical pirate folklore, though the ring's provenance remains mysterious. Ethan stared at the display for a long time, remembering pale green eyes and the sound of his name called across 3 centuries. Then he walked out of the museum and into his future, carrying the weight of legend and the knowledge that somewhere in the past his friends were still sailing toward their destiny. In his apartment that night, as he worked on new equations that might someday allow him to control temporal rifts instead of simply stumbling through them, Ethan Reyes smiled and thought he heard the distant sound of wind in rigging and waves against a ship's hull. Somewhere in 1720, Captain Arabella Vane stood at the bow of the Stormcrow and watched the aurora dance across the Caribbean sky, remembering a strange young man who taught her crew that legends were just truth waiting to be discovered. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The bronze shield gleamed under the museum's harsh fluorescent lights, its surface pitted with age and battle scars. 17-year-old Marcus Chen pressed closer to the display case, ignoring his classmates' chatter about the field trip ending soon. The placard read Spartan Hoplon Shield, 5th century BCE, on loan from the Athens Archaeological Museum. But what drew Marcus wasn't the historical significance. It was the crack running through the bronze, revealing something that glowed faintly beneath. "Hey Chen, stop drooling over rusty metal and come on," called Jake from across the ancient Greece exhibit. "Bus leaves in 5 minutes." Marcus waved him off, transfixed by the serpentine design etched around the shield's rim. The snake appeared to be eating its own tail, the metalwork so intricate it seemed almost alive in the shifting light. Without thinking, he reached out and touched the glass barrier. The security rope had somehow fallen away, leaving the case partially open. His fingertips brushed the crack in the bronze. The world exploded into blinding white light. Pain lanced through his skull as consciousness returned. Marcus groaned, tasting dust and something metallic. Blood. His head throbbed with each heartbeat, and when he opened his eyes, the sterile museum lighting was gone. Instead, harsh Mediterranean sunlight beat down on him from a cloudless sky. "Get up, you worthless dog!" The words were shouted in a language Marcus somehow understood, though he'd never heard it before. A shadow fell across him as someone grabbed his arm and yanked him upright. Marcus found himself staring into the weathered face of a man whose dark eyes held no warmth. The stranger wore a bronze breastplate over a crimson cloak, a short sword at his hip. "I said, get up!" The man's grip tightened painfully. "You think you can run from the Agoj? Think you can hide in the dust like a coward?" Marcus stumbled to his feet, his modern sneakers slipping on the packed earth. Around him, the air rang with the sounds of combat training, wooden spears clacking together, grunts of effort, and the harsh commands of instructors. Dozens of young men, none older than 20, practiced formations in the scorching heat. Their bronzed bodies gleamed with sweat as they moved with deadly precision. Where am I?" Marcus stammered. The instructor's eyes narrowed. "Playing foolish games, are we?" His hand moved to his sword hilt. "You're in the Agog, boy, training ground of Spartan warriors, and if you don't start acting like one, you'll feed the crows before sunset." Spartan? The word hit Marcus like a physical blow. This wasn't possible. He'd been in the museum touching the shield, and now... He looked down at himself, noting his jeans and t-shirt looked utterly foreign among the leather and bronze surrounding him. His smartphone was gone, as was his backpack. Only the clothes on his back remained from his real life. "You dress strangely for a Spartan youth," the instructor said, suspicion creeping into his voice. "Where are you from, boy?" Marcus's mind raced. How could he possibly explain? "I'm not from around here." "Clearly." The man studied him with calculating eyes. "You'll train with the others. Keep up or die. Those are your choices." He shoved Marcus toward a group of teenagers engaged in weapons practice. "And lose those ridiculous shoes. Spartans train barefoot." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and confusion. Marcus was thrust into sword drills he'd never learned, forced to run across terrain that tore his feet bloody, and pummeled by opponents who'd been training since childhood. Every mistake earned him a blow from the instructor's staffs. Every sign of weakness brought mockery from the other trainees. "Look at him stumble like a newborn calf," sneered a broad-shouldered boy with cold blue eyes. "Are we training warriors or wet nurses?" "Enough, Alexios," said another voice. Marcus turned to see a lean youth with intelligent dark eyes stepping between them. "He's learning. We all had to start somewhere." "You defend weakness, Nicomedes?" Alexios spat. "In Sparta the weak serve only one purpose, to die so the strong may live." Nicomedes didn't flinch, and the wise know when to speak and when to train. "Which are you doing?" For a moment Marcus thought Alexios might attack his defender. Instead, the blonde boy smiled coldly and turned back to his drills. But Marcus caught the promise of violence in his eyes. That first night, as the other boys settled on their rough straw pallets, Nicomedes approached Marcus's corner of the sleeping quarters. The older boy moved quietly, careful not to wake the others. "You're not Spartan," he said simply. "Your accent is wrong, your movements untrained. Where do you really come from?" Marcus weighed his options. The truth was impossible to believe, but lies would only complicate things further. "Somewhere far away," he said finally, "very far away." Nicomedes nodded thoughtfully. "Your strange knowledge today, the way you tied knots, how you cleaned that wound on Demonicos' arm. Where did you learn such things?" During the training, Marcus had instinctively used techniques he'd learned in Boy Scouts and first aid class. The Spartan methods were crude by comparison, and he'd helped where he could. "My teachers, they showed me different ways. Different indeed." Nicomedes settled beside him, keeping his voice low. "You spoke of pressure points when stopping bleeding, mentioned something called infection. These are not words I know, yet they seem wise." Marcus felt a spark of hope. If he could find even one ally in this brutal place, perhaps he had a chance of survival. "I can share what I know, if you'll help me understand your ways. A fair trade." Nicomedes extended his hand in the Spartan manner, gripping Marcus's forearm. "But know this, the instructors will show you no mercy for being foreign. Here, you either prove yourself or you die. There is no third option." The words proved prophetic. The following days brought increasing brutality as the instructors tested Marcus's limits. Dawn runs across mountain paths left his feet shredded and bleeding. Wrestling matches left him bruised and battered. Weapons training with wooden swords resulted in cracked ribs and split lips. Yet slowly, impossibly, he began to adapt. His modern understanding of anatomy helped him avoid serious injury. His knowledge of leverage and physics improved his fighting technique, and most importantly, his alliance with Nicomedes provided crucial insights into Spartan culture and expectations. "They're not just testing your strength," Nicomedes explained as they shared meagre rations of black broth and barley bread. "They're testing your spirit. Can you endure suffering without complaint? Will you protect your fellow Spartans even at cost to yourself? Do you have the will to kill when killing is necessary?" That last question haunted Marcus. In his world, violence was something you saw in movies or video games. Here, it was the foundation of existence. Every day brought training in how to efficiently end human life, and every night he wondered what kind of person he was becoming. The breaking point came during their third week, when the instructors announced a survival exercise. Each trainee would be sent into the Laconian wilderness with nothing but a bronze dagger and the clothes on their back. They were to survive for 7 days, hunting their own food and finding their own shelter. "This is your first taste of the Crypteia," announced the chief instructor, a scarred veteran named Cleomenes. "The secret war that every Spartan must learn to fight. You will be alone, cold and hungry. The weak will not return. The strong will forge themselves in hardship's fire." As they prepared to depart, Alexios cornered Marcus near the armory. "I know what you are," he hissed. "Some foreign spy, maybe a Persian agent sent to weaken us from within. But you won't survive the wilderness. I'll make sure of it." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "I'm not your enemy, Alexios." "All outsiders are enemies." The blonde boy's hand rested on his dagger hilt. "Sparta for Spartans. The weak and foreign have no place among us." The wilderness of Laconia stretched endlessly in all directions, a landscape of rocky hills, dense forests, and hidden ravines that could shelter wild beasts or enemy raiders. Marcus found himself alone for the first time since arriving in this ancient world, with nothing but his wits and hard-earned training to keep him alive. The first day brought the harsh lesson of hunger. His modern sensibilities recoiled from the idea of killing animals for food, but his growling stomach soon overcame such squeamishness. Using techniques he'd learned in outdoor survival courses, he fashioned snares from plant fibers and caught small game. The meat was tough and gamey, but it kept him alive. By the third day, he'd found a defensible cave near a stream and established a routine of hunting, gathering, and maintaining his shelter. His feet had toughened from weeks of barefoot training, and his hands no longer blistered from handling rough tools and weapons. Perhaps most importantly, his mind had adapted to the constant alertness required for survival. That night, as he roasted a rabbit over his small fire, Marcus heard the snap of a twig outside his cave. He froze, every sense straining. Then Alexios stepped into the firelight, bronze dagger gleaming in his hand. "Did you think I wouldn't follow you?" the Spartan boy said. "Did you think I'd let you return and corrupt our ranks with your foreign weakness?" Marcus rose slowly, his own dagger appearing in his hand. "This doesn't have to happen, Alexios. We're both Spartans now." "You will never be Spartan!" Alexios lunged forward, his blade seeking Marcus's throat. The fight that followed was nothing like the controlled training matches in the Agoge. This was desperate, brutal, and potentially fatal. Alexios fought with skill honed by years of training, but Marcus had advantages the Spartan boy didn't expect. His modern understanding of anatomy let him target vulnerable spots. His knowledge of physics helped him use leverage against his stronger opponent. They grappled in the dirt outside the cave, each seeking to drive his blade home. Alexios was stronger, but Marcus was more desperate. When the blonde boy tried to pin him down, Marcus used a wrestling move he'd learned in high school, rolling his opponent and reversing their positions. For a moment, Marcus held the advantage. Alexios lay beneath him, dagger knocked away, throat exposed. One thrust would end the fight forever. The Spartan way demanded it. Kill or be killed. Show no mercy to enemies. But as Marcus raised his blade, he saw something in Alexios's eyes that stopped him cold. Not just fear, but desperate need. This boy had been raised from birth to believe that only the strong deserved to live, that showing mercy was tantamount to treason against Spartan values. He expected to die because Marcus had proven stronger. "I'm not going to kill you," Marcus said quietly. Alexios stared at him in shock. "What?" "We're both Spartans. We both serve the same purpose." Marcus stood and offered his hand. "The real enemy isn't each other. It's the wilderness, the cold, the hunger. Fight those, not me." For a long moment Alexios remained on the ground, staring at the extended hand. Then, slowly, he reached up and grasped it. Marcus pulled him to his feet, and they stood facing each other in the flickering firelight. "I don't understand you," Alexios said finally. "Neither do I, sometimes." Marcus gestured to his fire and the roasted meat. "But I understand hunger. Share my fire tonight. Tomorrow we can go back to being rivals." They sat in awkward silence, sharing the meal and warmth. As the fire burned low, Alexios finally spoke again. "Where are you really from? And don't say, far away. I want the truth." Marcus stared into the dying flames, weighing his words carefully. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me. I'm from another time, a time far in the future, where men have forgotten how to be warriors, where battles are fought with weapons you can't imagine, and people live in cities larger than all of Sparta." Alexios was quiet for a long time. "That's impossible." "I know it is, but it's true. How did you come here?" Marcus told him about the museum, the bronze shield, the strange glow he'd seen in the crack. As he spoke, he remembered something that made his pulse quicken, the serpent symbol etched around the shield's rim, eating its own tail. "I've seen that symbol," Alexios said when Marcus described it. "In the old caves, where our ancestors made offerings to the gods. There are carvings there, ancient even by Spartan standards." "Where?" Marcus's heart raced. "Where are these caves?" "Half a day's journey north, but they're forbidden. Cursed, some say. Why do you want to know?" "Because that symbol might be my way home." They set out at first light, travelling through terrain that grew increasingly wild and treacherous. The caves Alexios spoke of lay hidden in a narrow ravine, their entrances almost invisible among the rocky cliffs. Ancient stone markers warned away the curious, carved with symbols that predated even the early Spartan settlements. Inside the largest cave, Marcus found what he was looking for. The walls were covered with primitive paintings and carvings, some depicting scenes of hunting and warfare. But at the very back, in a natural alcove that felt heavy with age and power, he found the serpent. The symbol was identical to the one on the bronze shield, a snake consuming its own tail, carved into the living rock with painstaking detail. But more importantly, beneath the carving sat something that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. It looked like an hourglass, but made of materials he couldn't identify. The frame appeared to be some kind of crystal or precious stone, while the sand inside glowed with a faint pulsing light. the same light he'd seen in the crack of the museum shield. "What is that thing?" Alexios whispered. Marcus reached for the artifact with trembling hands. The moment his fingers touched its surface, energy coursed up his arms. The cave around him seemed to shimmer and blur, as if reality itself was becoming unstable. "It's my way home," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, Marcus found himself hesitating. Home meant returning to his comfortable life of school and video games and fast food. It meant leaving behind the harsh but purposeful world he'd begun to understand. It meant abandoning Nicomedes, and yes, even Alexios, who had become something more than enemies in the wilderness. "You would leave us?" Alexios asked, and for the first time since Marcus had known him, the blonde boy's voice held no mockery or cruelty. "Leave Sparta? I don't belong here," Marcus said, though the words felt hollow. "I'm not really a Spartan. Aren't you?" Alexios gestured to Marcus's scarred hands, his sun-darkened skin, the lean muscle he'd built through weeks of brutal training. "You've endured the same trials we have, bled the same blood, shared the same struggles." It was true. The soft teenager who'd touched a museum display case felt like a different person entirely. This Marcus had learned to fight, to survive, to push beyond limits he'd never imagined. He'd found strength he didn't know he possessed, and forged bonds deeper than any friendship from his old life. But he'd also seen the darkness of this world, the casual acceptance of violence, the rigid hierarchy that crushed individual thought, the expectation that weakness deserved death. How much of himself was he willing to sacrifice to belong here? A distant horn echoed through the ravine, interrupting his thoughts, the signal for the end of the survival trial. They had to return. "Come on," Alexios said. "Whatever you decide, we need to get back before they send search parties." They emerged from the caves to find the other survivors already gathering at the designated meeting point. Of the 30 who had entered the wilderness, only 23 remained. Some had fallen to wild animals, others to exposure or starvation. The instructors showed no emotion at the losses. This was simply the way of things. "So the foreigners' lives," sneered one of the survivors, a brutish boy named Pantetes. "I'm surprised the wolves didn't finish him off." "He fought well," Alexios said simply, and the unexpected defence silenced Pantetes. If Alexios, who had openly despised Marcus, now spoke for him, others would listen. Nicomedes appeared at Marcus's shoulder, relief evident in his dark eyes. "I worried you might not return. The mountains are dangerous, especially for those unused to them." "I had help," Marcus said, glancing at Alexios, "and I learned things about myself I didn't know." The march back to the Agog took most of the day. As they crested the final hill overlooking the training grounds, Marcus felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been homecoming. The harsh landscape, the shouting instructors, the smell of sweat and bronze. It had all become familiar, even comforting in its brutal predictability. But their trials weren't over. Chief Instructor Cleomenes waited for them in the main courtyard, flanked by several senior warriors whose scarred faces spoke of decades of warfare. 23 return, he announced. 7 proved themselves unworthy of Spartan blood, but for the rest of you, one final test remains. He gestured, and weapon racks were brought forward, not the wooden training swords they'd grown accustomed to, but real bronze blades honed to razor sharpness. "You will fight," Cleomenes continued, "not to practice, not to learn, but to prove. Each of you will face an opponent chosen by the instructors. Victory brings graduation to full warrior status. Defeat." He shrugged. "The wounded may recover and try again next season. The dead will feed the carrion birds." Marcus felt his blood turn cold. They were expected to fight to the death? But looking around at his fellow trainees, he saw only acceptance on their faces. This was the Spartan way. Only the strong survived to take their place in the ranks of the warriors. "Marcus of the Strange Lands," Cleomenes called, "you will face Alexios, son of Lysander." A murmur ran through the assembled trainees. Everyone knew of their rivalry, their confrontation in the wilderness. This would be a popular match among the spectators already gathering at the edge of the combat circle. As they took their positions, bronze swords glinting in the afternoon sun, Marcus found himself thinking of the artifact hidden in his belt pouch. He'd managed to conceal it during the march back, and its weight seemed to pulse against his hip. One touch, one moment of concentration, and he could escape this world forever. but that would mean abandoning his friend Nicomedes, leaving Alexios, who had grown from enemy to grudging ally, fleeing from a life that had forged him into someone stronger than he'd ever imagined possible. "Begin!" Cleomenes shouted. Alexios came forward cautiously, his blade held in perfect form. Around them the crowd grew silent, straining to see every detail of what many expected to be a fight to the death. "I won't kill you," Marcus said quietly as they circled each other. "And I won't kill you," Alexios replied, "but we must make them believe we might." They began to duel, bronze ringing against bronze in a deadly dance. Both had learned much in their weeks of training, and both fought with skill that impressed the watching instructors. Marcus used his knowledge of anatomy and physics to find openings, while Alexios countered with perfect Spartan technique and years of experience. Back and forth they went, neither gaining decisive advantage. Cuts appeared on arms and legs, blood stained the packed earth, but somehow both fighters managed to avoid fatal wounds. The crowd grew restless. They wanted to see death, not an extended dance. "Finish it," someone shouted. "One of you must fall." That's when Marcus saw his opportunity. As Alexios pressed forward with a particularly aggressive attack, Marcus sidestepped and grabbed his opponent's sword arm. To the watching crowd, it would look like he was setting up for a killing blow. Instead, he whispered urgently in Alexios' ear. "Trust me," he said, then swept the blonde boy's legs and sent him crashing to the ground. Marcus stood over his fallen opponent, bronze sword raised high. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the death blow. Instead, Marcus planted his blade point first in the earth and offered his hand to help Alexios up. "Spartans don't kill Spartans," he declared loudly enough for all to hear. "We are brothers in war, united against all enemies. This man fought well and honourably. He deserves respect, not death." For a moment, the silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Chief Instructor Cleomenes stepped forward, his weathered face unreadable. "Interesting philosophy," he said. "And where did you learn this wisdom, young Marcus?" "From a teacher far away," Marcus replied. "One who understood that strength shared is strength multiplied." Cleomenes studied him for a long moment, then looked at Alexios, who had accepted Marcus's help and now stood beside him. "And you agree with this foreign wisdom, son of Lysander?" Alexios straightened his shoulders. "Marcus has proven himself in training, in the wilderness, and now in combat. If having him as an ally makes Sparta stronger, then I call him brother." The older warrior nodded slowly. "Then you have both passed your trials. Not because you know how to kill, any fool with a sharp stick can kill, but because you know when not to kill, and that is wisdom few warriors ever achieve." The crowd erupted in surprised cheers. It was an unprecedented decision, but Cleomenes was a respected veteran whose judgment carried great weight. Other pairs of fighters, inspired by what they'd witnessed, began finding ways to end their duels without fatalities. Not all succeeded. The brutal realities of Spartan training still claimed 2 lives that day, but the precedent had been set. As the sun set over the training grounds, Marcus found himself officially recognized as a Spartan warrior. He bore the scars, had endured the trials and earned the respect of his peers. For all practical purposes, he belonged here now. That night, as he sat with Nicomedes and Alexios around a small fire, sharing wine and stories of their trials, Marcus felt the weight of the artifact in his pouch. It still glowed faintly, still pulsed with the energy that could return him to his own time. But for the first time since arriving in this ancient world, he wasn't sure he wanted to use it. "What are you thinking about?" Nicomedes asked, noting his distant expression. "Home," Marcus said simply, "and whether it's a place you come from or a place you choose to be." "Deep thoughts for a warrior fresh from his trials," Alexios said with a grin that held none of his former cruelty. "Save such philosophy for the old men who have nothing better to do than contemplate their navels." "Maybe," Marcus agreed, "or maybe that's exactly when such thoughts matter most, when you're young enough to act on them." He reached into his pouch and withdrew the ancient artifact, letting its glow illuminate their small circle. His companions stared at it in wonder, neither having seen its like before. "What is it?" Nicomedes breathed. "My way home," Marcus said. "My ticket back to the world I came from." For a moment they sat in silence, watching the strange light pulse and dance. Then Alexios spoke, his voice unusually serious. "Whatever world you came from, it made you strong enough to survive here. strong enough to change how we see things. Maybe that was the point. Marcus looked at his friends, for that's what they had become, forged in the crucible of shared hardship and mutual respect. In his own time, he'd had acquaintances, people he hung out with at school or texted occasionally, but never anything like the bonds he'd formed here, tempered by real danger and genuine trust. Yet he also thought of his parents, who would be wondering where he'd disappeared to. His little sister, who despite her bratty tendencies, he genuinely missed. The comfortable life of hot showers, warm beds, and unlimited food that awaited him if he chose to return. Decisions are easier when you have no choice, he said finally. Then make a choice that gives you more choices later, Nicomedes suggested. The artifact will still work tomorrow, won't it? Or next week. Marcus nodded. The device showed no signs of instability or decay. If anything, it seemed to pulse more strongly now that he'd found it, as if responding to his proximity. Then stay a while longer, Alexios said. Learn what it truly means to be Spartan. See if this world can become home, or if your other world calls too strongly to ignore. It was reasonable advice, and Marcus found himself nodding. One more season, he decided. Let me see what kind of warrior I can become, what kind of man I can be here. Then I'll choose. The artifact's glow seemed to pulse in approval as he tucked it away. Around them, the sounds of the agog settled into evening quiet, the distant conversations of guards on duty, the rustle of wind through the training grounds, the soft snores of exhausted young warriors getting their rest. Marcus lay back on his rough pallet, staring up at stars that looked exactly the same as they had in his own time. Some things, he reflected, were truly eternal. The struggle to find one's place in the world, the bonds forged through shared adversity, the choice between comfort and purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new training, and eventually new battles. The Spartans were always at war with someone, Athenians, Persians, or rebellious helots. He would face real combat, real danger, and discover what kind of warrior he truly was. But tonight, for the first time since touching that bronze shield in a museum that wouldn't exist for thousands of years, Marcus Chen felt at peace. He had found strength he didn't know he possessed, friends who had become brothers, and a purpose greater than anything his old life had offered. The choice between worlds would come again, he knew. But for now, he was content to be exactly where he was, a young Spartan warrior, scarred by trials and strengthened by adversity, carrying the wisdom of both past and future in his heart. As sleep claimed him, Marcus's hand unconsciously moved to the artifact hidden beneath his pillow. It pulsed once, gently, as if acknowledging his decision. Then its glow faded to a barely perceptible ember, waiting patiently for the moment when its power would be needed again. In the distance, a wolf howled across the Laconian hills, and Marcus smiled in his sleep. He was no longer afraid of wolves, or darkness, or the brutal uncertainties of ancient life. He had become something new, not quite the modern teenager he'd been, not quite the ancient warrior his training had shaped him into, but a bridge between worlds, carrying the best of both into whatever future awaited. The bronze shield in that distant museum had cracked for a reason, he thought, drowsily. Some barriers were meant to be broken, some journeys were meant to be taken, and sometimes finding yourself required losing everything you thought you knew about who you were supposed to be. Marcus Chen had come to ancient Sparta by accident, but he would stay by choice, at least for now. The future, both past and present, could wait for one more season while a young warrior learned exactly what he was capable of becoming. The next story is about to begin, please relax and enjoy. The storm hammered against the windows of the Whitmore mansion like an angry fist, each thunderclap making Maya jump as she pressed her face to the rain-streaked glass. The old Victorian house had been abandoned for decades, its Gothic towers and weathered shingles creating jagged silhouettes against the lightning-torn sky. Her friends had dared her to spend an hour inside during the storm, laughing as they drove away in Jake's car, leaving her alone with nothing but her phone's flashlight and her stubborn pride. The front door creaked open with surprising ease, as if the house itself was welcoming her inside. Dust particles danced in her phone's beam as she stepped into the foyer, her sneakers echoing against warped hardwood floors. Portraits of stern-faced men and women in elaborate wigs stared down from the walls, their eyes seeming to track her movement through the shadows. The air smelled of mould and something else, something older, like parchment and forgotten secrets. Maya had always been drawn to history, spending countless hours reading about distant times and places, imagining what it would be like to walk through ancient Rome or witness the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But standing in this decaying monument to the past, she felt only an unsettling chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Thunder crashed overhead, and Maya decided to explore deeper into the house. The basement door stood slightly ajar at the end of a narrow hallway, and she found herself drawn toward it despite every instinct screaming at her to leave. The wooden stairs groaned under her weight as she descended into the musty darkness below. The basement was a maze of stone walls and forgotten storage. Cobwebs draped like ghostly curtains from the ceiling, and rats scurried away from her light. Old furniture covered in dust sheets created strange shapes in the shadows, like sleeping giants waiting to wake. Maya picked her way carefully through the debris, fascination overcoming her fear. It was behind a stack of wine barrels, in the deepest corner of the basement, that she found it. At first it looked like just another section of the stone wall, but as she moved closer, her light revealed intricate carvings etched into what appeared to be an ancient wooden door. The symbols were unlike anything she'd seen before. Not quite Celtic, not quite French, but somehow familiar, as if she'd glimpsed them in dreams. The door had no visible handle, but when Maya pressed her palm against the central carving, a fleur-de-lis intertwined with a skeletal hand, it gave way with a deep, resonant click. Light erupted from the opening. Not the harsh white of electricity, but something warmer, more alive, pulsing like a heartbeat made of gold and fire. The light pulled at her, and Maya felt her feet leave the ground. The basement, the storm, the entire world dissolved around her as she tumbled through radiance that sang with voices from another time. She awoke to the sound of shouting and the stench of unwashed bodies and human waste. Maya's head pounded as she struggled to her feet, finding herself in a cramped stone cellar, lit only by weak sunlight filtering through a barred window near the ceiling. Her modern clothes, jeans, sneakers, and a North Face jacket, felt alien against her skin as she realised she was no longer in the Whitmore basement. The shouting grew louder as she climbed a set of narrow stairs towards street level. When she pushed open a heavy wooden door, the assault on her senses was overwhelming. The street beyond was narrow and filthy, running with sewage and rotting garbage. Buildings leaned precariously over the cobblestones, their upper floors nearly touching across the alley. And everywhere, people pressed together in a seething mass of rage and desperation. Maya stepped into the crowd, immediately struck by their appearance. The people wore rough, patched clothing in shades of brown and grey. Many were gaunt with hunger, their eyes hollow and fierce. They carried makeshift weapons, kitchen knives, farming tools, clubs studded with nails, and their chants filled the air with terrifying energy. Mort aux aristocrates, Vive la République, Liberté ou la mort. Poster covered every available surface, many stained with what looked disturbingly like blood. Maya couldn't read the French, but the images were clear enough. Guillotines, severed heads, figures in elaborate dress being dragged toward their doom. Her stomach lurched as the reality of her situation began to sink in. A woman in a tattered dress shoved past her, screaming something about bread and justice. Maya stumbled backward, bumping into a man carrying a pitchfork. He turned toward her with suspicious eyes, taking in her strange clothing and clean appearance. "Qu'est-ce que c'est?" he snarled, grabbing her jacket. "Tu es aristocrate." Maya didn't speak French, but the menace in his voice was universal. Other faces turned toward her, expressions shifting from curiosity to hostility as they noticed her modern clothes and well-fed appearance. She looked nothing like the desperate, downtrodden people surrounding her. "Espionne!" someone shouted. "Spy! Austrian spy!" The crowd pressed closer, and Maya realised with growing terror that these people were ready to tear her apart with their bare hands. She broke free from the man's grip and ran, pushing through the mob as hands grabbed at her jacket and voices screamed accusations behind her. She burst into a larger square where vendors sold rotting vegetables and scraps of meat crawling with flies. The buildings here were grander but scarred with revolutionary graffiti and broken windows. Maya ducked behind a market stall, her heart hammering as she tried to make sense of what was happening. You're not from here." The voice spoke English with a slight French accent. Maya spun around to find a boy about her age crouched beside a pile of empty crates. He was thin and dirty, dressed in patched breeches and a shirt that had once been white. His dark hair hung in greasy tangles, but his eyes were intelligent and kind. "How did you... Who are you?" Maya gasped. "Name's Lucian," he said, glancing around nervously. "And you're in deep trouble, mademoiselle. Looking like that, talking like that. They'll have your head on a pike before sunset. My head on a... What year is this?" Lucian stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. 1793, of course. The year 2 of the Republic. Though I suppose if you're from England or Austria, you might not know our revolutionary calendar. The French Revolution. Maya's head spun as the pieces fell into place. The guillotines on the posters, the bloodthirsty crowds, the desperate poverty. She had somehow travelled back in time to one of the most violent periods in human history. "I need help," she whispered. "I don't belong here. I need to find a way home." Lucian studied her for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. "Come with me. Keep your mouth shut and do exactly what I say." He led her through a maze of back alleys, avoiding the main streets where revolutionaries marched with their banners and weapons. Maya tried to walk like Lucienne, hunched over, eyes down, moving with the furtive quickness of someone who lived in constant fear. "Here," Lucian said, pulling her into an abandoned building. "Take off that jacket. And those shoes. They scream aristocrat." Maya hesitated, but the memory of those hostile faces convinced her to comply. Lucian produced a grimy coat and wooden clogs from a pile of rags in the corner. "Better," he said as she struggled into the oversized garments. "Now rub some dirt on your face and hands, and whatever you do, don't speak unless absolutely necessary. Your accent will give you away in seconds." As Maya disguised herself, Lucian explained the situation. The revolution had devoured its own children, turning increasingly violent as factions fought for control. Anyone suspected of aristocratic sympathies faced the guillotine, and paranoia ran so deep that neighbours regularly denounced each other. "But why are you helping me?" Maya asked. Lucian's expression darkened. "My family were servants in a great house. When the revolution came, we thought things would get better for people like us. Instead, they got worse. The new masters are just as cruel as the old ones, maybe crueler, and I've heard stories, rumours about doors that lead to other times, other places. If such things exist, maybe there's hope for escape." "Doors to other times?" Maya's pulse quickened. "What kind of doors?" "Old stories, probably nonsense, but they say the ancient kings had secret passages, ways to flee when the people rose up. Some claim there's one hidden in the catacombs beneath the city, marked with royal symbols and protected by old magic, the catacombs." Maya remembered reading about the underground ossuaries that honeycombed Paris, filled with the bones of millions of dead. If there was a way back to her own time, it might be hidden in those ancient tunnels. "Can you take me there?" she asked. Before Lucian could answer, shouts erupted in the street outside. Through a broken window, Maya saw a procession approaching, soldiers in blue uniforms surrounding a cart filled with prisoners. At the front of the procession, a massive wooden scaffold on wheels dominated the street. The guillotine. Maya had seen drawings in history books, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of the killing machine. It towered above the crowd like a hungry giant, its angled blade gleaming dully in the afternoon sun. The wooden framework was stained dark with blood, and the crowd pressed close to get a better view as the executioner prepared for his work. The prisoners were dragged from the cart one by one, men and women in tattered finery, their faces pale with terror. Maya recognised the unmistakable bearing of aristocracy even in their defeated state. One woman, barely older than Maya herself, stumbled as she was forced up the scaffold steps. "Don't watch," Lucian whispered. But Maya couldn't look away. The crowd's bloodlust was palpable, their cheers growing louder as each head fell. Maya felt sick, but also transfixed by the raw savagery of it all. This wasn't the sanitised version of history she'd read about. This was real terror, real death, real human beings reduced to entertainment for the mob. A soldier spotted them in the window and pointed in their direction. Maya and Lucian scrambled away as boots thundered up the stairs toward their hiding place. "This way." Lucian grabbed her hand and pulled her toward a hole in the floor that led to the building's cellar. They dropped down just as soldiers burst into the room above. The cellar connected to a network of tunnels that seemed to extend throughout the neighbourhood. Lucian moved through them with practiced ease, leading Maya deeper underground until the sounds of the search party faded behind them. "We need to find that map," Lucian panted as they rested in a wider chamber. "There's a printing shop on Rue Saint-Antoine. They produce revolutionary pamphlets, but the owner is sympathetic to those seeking alternatives to the current situation." The printing shop was a cramped, chaotic space filled with the smell of ink and hot metal. The proprietor, a nervous man named Desailly, eyed them suspiciously until Lucian mentioned the catacombs. Then his expression changed to one of desperate hope. "You're not the first to ask about the old passages," he whispered, glancing around his shop as if spies might be hiding among the printing presses. "There are stories, legends of doors that lead to other realms, other times. The kings used them to escape their enemies, or so they say." He produced a pamphlet from beneath a stack of revolutionary newspapers. At first glance, it appeared to be another call to arms against the enemies of the Republic. But when Desailly held it up to the light, Maya could see faint lines beneath the printed text, a map of tunnels and chambers, marked with symbols that matched those she'd seen on the door in the Whitmore basement. "The cellar door of kings," Desailly breathed. "Hidden in the deepest part of the catacombs, where the bones of ancient royalty mingle with the common dead. They say it opens only for those who carry the proper key." Maya's hand moved instinctively to her pocket, where the brass key she'd found in the basement still rested. She hadn't even realised she'd brought it with her through the door. "We need to reach the catacombs," she told Lucian. "Tonight, before—" The shop door burst open, and 3 young people about Maya's age stumbled inside. But unlike Lucian, these street children had a harder edge, their eyes cold and calculating. "Well, well," one of them, a girl with matted blonde hair and a knife at her belt, looked Maya up and down. "This must be the foreign spy we've been hearing about." Lucian stepped protectively in front of Maya. "She's no spy, Margot. Just someone trying to survive like the rest of us." "Survive?" Margot laughed harshly. "Look at her hands, Lucian. Soft as a baby's. Look at her teeth. White and straight as nobles. This one's never known a day of real hardship in her life." The other street children spread out, blocking the exits. Maya realised with sick certainty that these were the allies Lucian had mentioned, his own people turning against him for the promise of reward. "The Committee of Public Safety is offering bread and meat for information about foreign agents," one of the boys said. "Enough food to last a month, maybe more." Maya saw the conflict in Lucian's face. He was starving too, she realised. They all were. In this world of revolutionary terror, betrayal was just another survival strategy. "I'm sorry," he whispered, but Maya was already moving. She grabbed the oil lamp from Desailly's desk and hurled it at the nearest window. Glass shattered, and burning oil splashed across the wooden floor. In the chaos that followed, Maya bolted through the broken window into the alley beyond. Behind her, she could hear Margot screaming orders to the others. Maya ran blindly through the narrow streets, her wooden clogs slipping on the wet cobblestones. She had no idea where she was going, only that she had to reach the catacombs before the revolutionary authorities caught up with her. The entrance she found was nothing more than a crack in a cemetery wall, hidden behind a weathered statue of some forgotten saint. Maya squeezed through just as she heard boots pounding on the street behind her. The darkness beyond was absolute, broken only by the faint phosphorescent glow of bones embedded in the tunnel walls. The Paris catacombs were a city of the dead, stretching for miles beneath the living city above. Millions of skeletons lined the passages in elaborate patterns, walls of femurs topped by grinning skulls, archways made from rib cages, entire chambers where bones formed geometric designs of haunting beauty. Maya had read that the catacombs held the remains of 6 million people, transferred here from overcrowded cemeteries centuries ago. Now, as she stumbled through the bone-lined corridors with only her phone's fading battery for light, the statistics became viscerally real. She was surrounded by death on an unimaginable scale, walking through galleries where human remains had been transformed into macabre art. The map from Desailly's shop was crude, but it gave her some sense of direction. She needed to reach the oldest section, where royal remains were said to rest apart from the common dead. But the tunnels branched and twisted in confusing patterns, and more than once Maya found herself in dead ends, surrounded by walls of empty eye sockets that seemed to watch her every move. Voices echoed from the tunnels behind her, Lucian's former allies had followed her underground. Maya quickened her pace, trying to muffle her footsteps on the bone-strewn floor. Her phone battery was dying, the light growing dimmer with each passing minute. She almost missed it, a section of wall where the bones were arranged differently, forming patterns that matched the symbols on her map. The brass key in her pocket grew warm as she approached, and Maya realised she was close to her destination. The door was hidden behind centuries of accumulated skulls, but when Maya pressed the key against the central symbol, the bone wall swung inward on silent hinges. Beyond lay a chamber that predated the catacombs, rough stone walls carved with fleur-de-lis and crowned eagles, the forgotten tomb of some ancient French king. And there, at the far end of the chamber, stood another door. This one was identical to the portal in the Whitmore basement, down to the intricate carvings and the warm golden light that leaked around its edges. Maya was running toward it when the chamber filled with flickering torchlight. Her pursuers had found her. "Seize the spy!" Margot's voice echoed off the stone walls. "In the name of the Republic!" Maya reached the door just as hands grabbed her from behind. She struggled desperately, the brass key slipping from her fingers to clatter on the stone floor. More revolutionaries poured into the chamber, not just Margot's gang, but adult soldiers with muskets and fixed bayonets. They dragged her back through the catacombs and up into the nightmare world of revolutionary Paris. The sun was setting, casting the city in shades of blood and shadow. Crowds lined the streets, eager for another spectacle of revolutionary justice. Maya found herself in a makeshift courtroom in what had once been a grand salon. The judge was a gaunt man in a black coat, his eyes burning with fanatic fervour. Behind him hung a banner reading La mort ou la liberté, death or liberty. "Citizen Maya," he intoned, reading from a document that someone had hastily prepared. "You stand accused of espionage against the Republic, of conspiracy with enemies of the people, and of attempting to aid the escape of traitors and aristocrats." Maya tried to speak, to explain that she wasn't a spy, wasn't even from this time, but every word that came out of her mouth only seemed to damn her further. Her accent, her confusion about basic revolutionary principles, her inability to name any other patriots, all of it pointed to guilt in the judge's mind. "The penalty for espionage is death," he declared as the crowd cheered. "The prisoner will be taken to the Place de la Révolution and executed at dawn." They locked her in a cell beneath the courthouse, a stone box barely large enough for her to lie down. Through the barred window she could hear the crowds gathering for tomorrow's entertainment. Vendors were already setting up stalls to sell food and drink to the spectators who had come to watch her die. Maya curled up on the filthy straw and tried to think. The brass key was gone, lost somewhere in the ancient royal tomb. Even if she could escape her cell, she had no way to open the door back to her own time. She was trapped in 1793, destined to become another casualty of the revolution's insatiable appetite for blood. As the night wore on, she heard other prisoners being brought in, men and women whose only crime was being born into the wrong social class or expressing the wrong political opinion. Some wept, others prayed, and a few maintained their dignity even in the face of certain death. Maya found their courage both inspiring and heartbreaking. Dawn came with the sound of drums and marching feet. The guards unlocked her cell and dragged her out into the grey morning light. The street leading to the Place de la Révolution was packed with spectators, men, women and children all eager to see the enemies of the Republic meet their fate. The guillotine stood in the centre of the square like a mechanical god, its blade catching the first rays of sunlight. The crowd pressed close, their faces twisted with bloodlust and revolutionary fervour. Maya had read about mob psychology, but experiencing it firsthand was terrifying beyond anything she could have imagined. They forced her up onto the scaffold and Maya could see the basket below, dark with dried blood from previous executions. The executioner was a massive man in a leather apron, his arms stained to the elbows. He grabbed Maya's shoulders, preparing to force her down onto the wooden bench. That was when the riot started. It began with a fight between two spectators over the best viewing position. Within seconds it had spread throughout the crowd as revolutionary factions turned on each other with the same violence they directed at their supposed enemies. Guards abandoned their posts to join the fighting, and in the chaos Maya found herself momentarily forgotten. She rolled off the scaffold and crawled beneath the guillotine's wooden platform. Above her the sounds of battle grew louder. Screams, gunshots, the crash of breaking glass and splintering wood. The revolution was devouring itself, just as she'd read in history books. It was then that she noticed the symbols carved into the guillotine's base, the same royal markings she'd seen in the catacombs and on the door in the Whitmore basement. The brass key in her pocket began to glow with warm light, and Maya realised that the executions had been taking place directly above another portal. The key fit perfectly into a hidden slot beneath the guillotine's mechanism. As Maya turned it, the wooden platform split open, revealing stairs that led down into golden radiance. She didn't hesitate. Behind her, the mob was fighting with increasing savagery, and she knew that her execution had only been delayed, not cancelled. The light enveloped her as she tumbled down the steps, and Maya felt the same sensation of dissolution she'd experienced in the Whitmore basement. The sounds of revolutionary Paris, drums, screams, the crash of the guillotine blade faded into silence as she fell through time itself. She landed hard on the dusty floor of the abandoned basement, her phone clattering away into the darkness. For a long moment, Maya lay still, hardly daring to believe she was really back in her own time. The storm was still raging outside, but after the terror of revolutionary Paris, it sounded almost peaceful. Maya struggled to her feet, her legs shaking with exhaustion and relief. Her clothes were torn and stained with dirt from the catacombs, and she could smell smoke and blood on her skin. But she was alive. She was home, and the nightmare was over. As she climbed the basement stairs, Maya's hand encountered something crumpled in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out and stared in amazement at a blood-stained revolutionary pamphlet, its French text calling for the execution of enemies of the Republic. Physical proof that her journey through time had been real, not just some elaborate hallucination brought on by the storm and the eerie atmosphere of the old house. Maya slammed the basement door behind her and ran through the Whitmore mansion toward the exit. Behind her, she could swear she heard the faint echo of revolutionary songs and the rhythmic thump of the guillotine blade. The house seemed to pulse with hidden energies, as if the very walls remembered the doorway she'd opened and the terrible time she'd visited. She burst through the front door into the storm, grateful for the clean rain on her face and the familiar sight of streetlights and power lines. Her friends were waiting in Jake's car, having returned to check on her after the storm intensified. "Maya," Sarah called out. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Maya climbed into the back seat, still clutching the revolutionary pamphlet. How could she explain what had happened? How could she make them understand that she'd witnessed one of history's most violent periods, that she'd felt the guillotine's shadow fall across her own neck? "Just a weird old house," she said finally, full of strange echoes. As they drove away, Maya stared back at the Whitmore mansion through the rain-streaked window. For just a moment, she thought she saw light flickering in the basement windows, warm, golden light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Then the house disappeared behind the trees, and Maya forced herself to look forward, toward her own time and her own life. But late at night, when she was alone in her room, she would take out the blood-stained pamphlet and read its revolutionary slogans. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she could swear she heard the distant sound of drums and the echo of crowds chanting for liberty or death. The past, it seemed, was never really past. It lived on in the spaces between moments, waiting for the right door to be opened, the right key to be turned. Maya kept the pamphlet hidden in her desk drawer, alongside the brass key that had somehow returned to her pocket during the journey home. She never spoke of what she'd experienced, but she found herself drawn to study the French Revolution with new intensity, reading every account of the terror she could find. The names became personal now: Robespierre, Marat, Charlotte Corday. She had walked among their shadows, breathed the same air, felt the same terror that had gripped all of France during those bloody years. Sometimes she wondered about Lucien, and whether he had survived the violence that consumed so many of his generation. She wondered about Margot and the other street children, about Desailly the printer, and all the unnamed faces in the revolutionary crowds. History books recorded the grand sweep of events, but they could never capture the individual human cost, the fear in a young girl's eyes as she faced the guillotine, the desperate hunger that drove people to betray their friends, the way terror could transform ordinary citizens into bloodthirsty monsters. The Whitmore mansion was demolished 6 months later, its Victorian grandeur erased to make room for a shopping centre. Maya read about it in the local newspaper, studying the photograph of bulldozers reducing the old house to rubble. The basement where she'd found the door was filled with concrete, sealing whatever portal had existed there beneath tons of modern construction. But Maya knew that time was more flexible than people realised, that the past and present existed simultaneously in ways that defied rational explanation. Somewhere beneath the busy shops and parking lots, in dimensions that curved back on themselves like cosmic doorways, the French Revolution continued to rage. The guillotine still fell, the crowd still called for blood, and the door of kings still waited for the right person with the right key to step through and witness history in all its terrible glory. Maya kept the brass key on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her clothing where no one could see it. She told herself it was just a memento, a reminder of an impossible experience that had shaped her understanding of human nature and historical truth. But sometimes, when she held it in her palm, she could feel it growing warm with mysterious energy, as if it were calling her back to other times, other places where the doors between worlds stood slightly ajar. She never answered that call. Once was enough. The French Revolution had taught her that some knowledge came at too high a price, that witnessing history firsthand meant accepting responsibility for the truth of human suffering and the fragility of civilization itself. Maya would carry that knowledge with her always, the weight of what she'd seen, the echo of guillotine drums that would follow her through all the quiet nights of her ordinary, precious modern life. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. Marcus Chen had always been the quiet one in his junior class, the kid who preferred ancient history documentaries to video games, who could recite Roman emperors in chronological order, but struggled to remember what he'd eaten for breakfast. So when Mrs. Davidson announced their field trip to the Metropolitan Museum's new Roman exhibition, he was the first to sign up and the last to complain when the bus broke down, extending their visit by 3 hours. While his classmates clustered around the interactive displays, snapping selfies with marble statues and complaining about the smell of old stone, Marcus found himself drawn deeper into the quieter sections of the exhibit. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across glass cases filled with ancient weapons, jewellery and pottery. He moved methodically from display to display, reading every placard, studying every artefact as if it might reveal some secret the museum curators had missed. It was in the farthest corner of the Roman military section that he found it. A bronze helmet, its surface green with age and marked by a spiderweb of hairline cracks that seemed to pulse in the shifting light. Unlike the other pristine artefacts, this one looked battle-worn, authentic in a way that made his chest tighten with inexplicable recognition. The placard read, "Gladiator's Helmet, circa 80 CE, origin unknown, recently acquired from a private collection. Note the unusual bronze composition and mysterious inscriptions along the crown." Marcus pressed closer to the glass, his breath fogging the surface. The helmet seemed to call to him, and without fully realising what he was doing, he found his hand reaching out. The security guard was distracted, helping an elderly visitor, and the case's motion sensors had been acting up all day according to the maintenance worker he'd overheard earlier. His fingertips touched the cool bronze and the world exploded. The museum floor tilted, the walls spun like a carnival ride, and a sound like thunder filled his ears. Colours bled together, the white of marble statues, the gold of Roman coins, the red of painted frescoes, all swirling into a vortex that pulled him down, down, down into darkness. When consciousness returned, it came with the taste of dust and the smell of human sweat mixed with animal waste. Marcus groaned, his head pounding as he tried to focus his eyes. Stone walls surrounded him, rough-hewn and stained with what looked like old blood. Straw covered the floor, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the clash of metal on metal, punctuated by shouted commands in a language he somehow understood but knew he shouldn't. Latin. They were speaking Latin. He sat up slowly, his modern clothes, jeans, sneakers, and a New York Giants hoodie, completely out of place in what appeared to be some sort of cell. The bronze helmet sat beside him, no longer cracked but gleaming as if freshly forged, somehow attached to his backpack by leather cords that definitely hadn't been there before. By Jupiter's beard! What manner of slave is this? The voice boomed from the cell's entrance, where a massive Roman soldier stood studying him with suspicious eyes. 2 more soldiers flanked him, their armour catching the torchlight that flickered from sconces along the corridor beyond. Marcus scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I'm not a slave," he said, then realised he'd spoken in Latin without thinking. How was that possible? The lead soldier laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the stone walls. "Not a slave? Then explain your strange garments and that sacred helmet of Mercurius. You're either a runaway gladiator or a very poor thief." He gestured to the other soldiers. "Bring him to Dr. Brutus. If he's a fighter, he'll earn his keep. If not..." He shrugged, the implication clear. They dragged him through a maze of corridors that opened into a vast training ground under the open sky. The Ludus Magnus, his history-obsessed brain supplied automatically. The great gladiator school of Rome. Sand covered the practice area, darkened in patches with old blood, and wooden weapons lined the walls. Dozens of men moved through combat drills, their bodies scarred and muscled, their eyes holding the flat wariness of those who lived each day knowing it might be their last. At the centre of it all stood a man who could only be Dr. Brutus. Tall, lean, with arms like iron bands and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. A long scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, and when he smiled at Marcus's approach, it was the expression of a wolf sizing up prey. "Another gift from our generous patron," Brutus said, circling Marcus like a predator. "What fighting experience do you have, boy?" "Fighting experience?" Marcus's voice cracked. I don't fight. I'm a student. There's been some kind of mistake." Brutus backhanded him casually, the blow sending Marcus sprawling into the sand. Blood filled his mouth, and his vision blurred. "Everyone fights here," Brutus said conversationally. "The only question is whether you fight well enough to live through tomorrow." He nudged Marcus with his foot. "Get up. Let's see what you're made of." The next few hours passed in a haze of pain and confusion. They thrust wooden weapons into his hands, first a gladius, then a spear, then a net and trident combination that nearly tangled him into unconsciousness. Each time he failed to meet Brutus's standards, which seemed to involve not dying immediately, the doctor would demonstrate the proper technique by beating Marcus with ruthless efficiency. "You move like a city boy," Brutus observed after Marcus had failed to block a simple sword thrust for the dozenth time. "Soft hands, soft mind. But..." He tilted his head, studying Marcus with new interest. "You learn quickly, and you see attacks before they come. Interesting." It was true, Marcus realised with surprise. After the initial shock wore off, some survival instinct had kicked in. He found himself anticipating Brutus's moves, not through skill but through pattern recognition. The same ability that helped him ace history tests was letting him read the subtle tells that preceded each attack. It wasn't enough to make him competent, but it was enough to keep him breathing. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the training ground, another gladiator approached their practice area. He was young, maybe 20, with the pale complexion and blue eyes of someone from the Northern Territories. Scars crisscrossed his arms and torso, but his movements held a fluid grace that spoke of years of training. "Doctore," the young man said, bowing slightly, "I am Gaius Valerius Maximus, though the men call me Valerius." "I heard you had a new recruit," Brutus grunted, "if you can call him that." "Darius, this is Valerius. He'll show you to your quarters and explain the rules. Try not to get yourself killed before your first real fight. I've got money riding on you lasting at least a week." Valerius helped Marcus to his feet, his grip strong but gentle. "Come," he said quietly. "You look ready to collapse." The gladiator quarters were sparse but clean. Long barracks lined with simple beds, each man's possessions limited to what could fit in a small wooden chest. Valerius led him to an empty bed near the back, away from the clusters of men who watched their arrival with calculating eyes. "You're not what they think you are," Valerius said once they were alone. It wasn't a question. Marcus considered lying, then decided on a version of the truth. "I'm lost. I don't know how I got here, and I don't know how to get home. And the helmet..." Marcus touched the bronze artifact still secured to his pack. Up close, he could see the inscriptions the museum placard had mentioned. Symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. "I found it. Or it found me. I think it's connected to why I'm here." Valerius nodded slowly. "The men have been talking about it. They say it's the helmet of Mercurius, that it brings victory to whoever wears it in the arena." The last man who owned it won 12 fights in a row before he earned his freedom. What happened to him? He tried to leave Rome. They found him 3 days later with his throat cut. Valerius's expression was grim. Freedom is rarely what they promise us it will be. Over the following days, Marcus learned the brutal rhythm of gladiator life. Dawn brought training, endless hours of sword work, spear fighting, and hand-to-hand combat that left his muscles screaming and his hands raw despite the cloth wrappings they gave him. Midday meant rest, food, and medical attention for the inevitable injuries. Afternoons brought more training, this time focused on specific fighting styles and arena tactics. The other gladiators remained suspicious of him, but Valerius proved to be a patient teacher and gradually a friend. He'd been captured during a raid on his village in Gaul 3 years earlier, and unlike many of the others who'd been broken by their circumstances, he maintained a quiet dignity and a stubborn hope that someday he'd see his homeland again. The trick, he told Marcus one evening as they tended to their wounds, is to remember who you were before this place tried to remake you. The moment you forget that, you become just another animal fighting for scraps. But not everyone was as accepting as Valerius. A gladiator named Quintus, a bull of a man with arms like tree trunks and a disposition to match, had taken an immediate dislike to Marcus. Perhaps it was jealousy over the attention the mysterious helmet generated, or maybe it was simple predatory instinct targeting the weakest member of the pack. Whatever the reason, he made Marcus's life miserable with a creativity that would have been impressive if it weren't so vicious. Strange clothes, strange speech, strange weapons, Quintus would mutter just loud enough for others to hear. Mark my words, there's something unnatural about this one. The gods don't favour pretenders. 2 weeks into his captivity, Marcus got his first taste of what waited for him beyond the training ground. They marched the gladiators through underground tunnels that reeked of fear and death. Emerging into the Hippodrome, the vast network of chambers and corridors beneath the Colosseum's arena floor. The sound hit him first. 50,000 voices creating a wall of noise that seemed to press against his chest. Then came the smells: sweat, blood, exotic animals, and the peculiar mixture of perfume and wine that marked the Roman elite in their seats high above. "Remember," Valerius whispered as they waited in the holding area, "the crowd loves a good show more than they love death. Give them drama, make them cheer, and you might live to see another sunset." Marcus's first opponent was a thin man with the hollow eyes of someone who'd already given up. They handed him wooden weapons, training gear that could still kill but was less likely to produce the spectacular arterial sprays that marked the more prestigious matches. His opponent wielded a net and trident, the retiarius fighting style, while Marcus found himself with a gladius and small shield, the basic secutor loadout. The gate lifted, and suddenly he was on the sand, the roar of the crowd crashing over him like a physical force. The Colosseum stretched impossibly high above him, tier upon tier of faces all focused on the small circle of sand where he stood trying not to vomit from terror. His opponent attacked immediately, the trident punching forward with surprising speed. Marcus stumbled backward, muscle memory from his training with Brutus taking over, where conscious thought failed. The net came next, and he barely managed to duck under it, the weights along its edge whistling past his ear. What saved him was his complete lack of formal training. Where an experienced gladiator would have followed predictable patterns, Marcus fought with the desperate creativity of someone who'd never learned the proper way to die. When the trident came again, instead of trying to block it with his shield, he grabbed a handful of sand and flung it at his opponent's eyes. While the man staggered, momentarily blinded, Marcus closed the distance and tackled him to the ground. They wrestled in the sand, the crowd's roar intensifying. Marcus had maybe 15 pounds and definitely several years on his opponent, but the man fought with the viciousness of someone who knew defeat meant death. Fingers clawed at Marcus's eyes, knees drove toward his groin, teeth snapped at any exposed flesh. In the end, it was Marcus's modern sensibilities that won the fight. Where his opponent expected him to go for a killing blow, Marcus instead trapped the man's arm in a wrestling hold he'd learned from YouTube videos, applying pressure until the man's shoulder made a wet popping sound, and he screamed in surrender. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered the unexpected tactics, others booed what they saw as an unsatisfying conclusion. But Emperor Domitian, presiding over the games from the imperial box, raised his thumb. mercy. Both fighters would live. As guards led them back to the hippodrome, Marcus's opponent grabbed his arm with his good hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "My family. They needed me to survive today." That night, back in the Ludus, the other gladiators treated Marcus differently. Not with respect exactly, but with the acknowledgement that he was no longer just meat waiting to be butchered. He'd proven he could survive, and in their world, that was the only currency that mattered. "You fought smart," Valerius said, helping him clean a cut on his forearm. "But next time they'll give you a real opponent. Someone with skill, not just desperation." Marcus nodded, his hands still shaking from adrenaline. As they talked, he noticed the bronze helmet seemed to glow more brightly than before, the inscriptions more distinct. It was reacting to something. The violence, the crowd's energy, or perhaps his own brush with death. Whatever it was, he could feel it building towards something, like a battery slowly charging. His second fight came 3 weeks later, and this time there was no mercy in the selection. His opponent was Lucius Aurelius, a veteran gladiator with 2 years of arena experience and 17 confirmed kills. Unlike Marcus's first fight, this one was scheduled as a true contest. Real weapons, real consequences, and the clear expectation that only one man would walk away. The night before the fight, Quintus cornered him in the latrines. "Tomorrow you die," the big gladiator said conversationally, "but before you do, I want that helmet. Hand it over now, and I'll make sure your death is quick." "It doesn't work that way," Marcus replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "The helmet chooses its bearer," Quintus laughed. "Superstitious nonsense. It's bronze and leather, nothing more." His hand dropped to the knife at his belt. "Give it to me, or I'll take it from your corpse." Before Marcus could respond, Valerius appeared in the doorway, his own blade already drawn. "Is there a problem here?" The tension stretched between them like a wire about to snap, then Quintus shrugged and backed away. "No problem. We were just discussing tomorrow's entertainment," but Marcus could see the calculation in the man's eyes, the patient hunger of a predator willing to wait for the right moment to strike. The next morning brought the familiar ritual, the march through the tunnels, the growing roar of the crowd, the final moments of preparation in the holding chambers. This time, though, Marcus strapped on the bronze helmet, feeling its weight settle onto his shoulders like destiny itself. Lucius Aurelius was everything Marcus was not. Tall, perfectly muscled, moving with the fluid confidence of someone who'd made killing into an art form. He carried a gladius and large shield, the classic gladiator configuration, and when he looked at Marcus across the arena, his smile held the warmth of winter in Germania. The fight began like a dance, both men circling, testing distance and timing. Aurelius was patient, content to let Marcus make the first mistake, while Marcus tried to apply everything Valerius and Brutus had taught him about reading an opponent. When Aurelius finally attacked, it was with a speed that made Marcus's previous opponent look like he'd been moving through honey. The gladius came in a perfect thrust aimed at Marcus's heart, and only the helmet's strange influence, a kind of premonition that came as a tingling along his scalp, gave him enough warning to twist aside. The blade scored along his ribs, drawing a line of fire that made him gasp, but he managed to get his own sword up in time to block the follow-up cut. The crowd roared its approval. They could sense they were watching a real contest. What followed was the longest 10 minutes of Marcus's life. Aurelius pressed his attack with methodical precision, each strike designed to wear down Marcus's defence until the inevitable killing blow could land. Marcus gave ground steadily, his breathing becoming laboured, his arms starting to burn from the constant defensive work. But something strange was happening. The helmet seemed to be feeding him information, not quite thoughts, but impressions, instincts that had no business being in a 16-year-old's head. He began to see patterns in Aurelius's attacks, to anticipate not just the next strike, but the one after that. When Aurelius overextended on a particularly aggressive thrust, Marcus stepped inside his guard and drove his elbow into the veteran's solar plexus. It was a modern fighting technique, one that no gladiator would expect, and Aurelius doubled over, gasping for air. Marcus could have killed him then, should have killed him, according to the crowd's increasing bloodthirsty chants. Instead, he stepped back, giving Aurelius time to recover, a mistake that nearly cost him everything. The veteran came up from his crouch with a hidden dagger, the blade streaking toward Marcus's throat in a move that would have ended the fight instantly. But the helmet's influence was stronger now, its bronze surface actually glowing in the afternoon sunlight, and Marcus moved with inhuman speed to catch Aurelius's wrist just inches from his neck. They stood locked together for a heartbeat, the dagger trembling between them, and Marcus could see surprise and something like fear in Aurelius's eyes. Then Marcus twisted, using leverage instead of strength, and the dagger went spinning across the sand. This time he didn't hesitate. His gladius found the gap in Aurelius's armour, sliding between ribs to pierce the man's heart. Aurelius looked down at the blade protruding from his chest, then up at Marcus, and smiled. "Well fought," he whispered, and died. The crowd went insane. Marcus had not just beaten a veteran gladiator, he'd done it with style, with drama, with the kind of unexpected reversals that made for legendary arena stories. Coins rained down from the stands, and somewhere in the imperial box Emperor Domitian was nodding his approval. But Marcus barely heard any of it. The helmet was singing in his mind now, its bronze surface blazing with an inner fire that he could feel, but that somehow didn't burn him. Power flowed through it, not just the energy of the crowd's adulation, but something deeper, older, connected to forces that existed long before Rome rose from the Seven Hills. That night, back in the gladiator quarters, the celebration was muted by the reality of their situation. Aurelius had been well liked, and his death cast a shadow over what should have been a victory feast. "You're changing," Valerius observed as they sat apart from the others. "The helmet, it's doing something to you." Marcus touched the bronze artifact, which had returned to its normal appearance but still hummed with latent energy. "I can feel it building towards something. Each fight, each moment of danger, it gets stronger. And what happens when it reaches full strength? I think it takes me home." Marcus looked around the torchlit barracks, at the scarred men who'd become his unlikely family, and felt a pang of guilt. "I think it always takes me home." But Quintus had been listening from the shadows, and that night, when the others slept, he made his move. Marcus woke to the sensation of the helmet being lifted from beside his bed, and opened his eyes to see Quintus's bulk silhouetted against the dim light from the corridor. The big gladiator moved with surprising stealth for his size, but the helmet's absence had broken whatever spell of sleep Marcus had been under. "I warned you," Quintus whispered, when he realised Marcus was awake. "It should have been mine from the beginning." Marcus rolled off his bed, coming to his feet in a crouch, but Quintus was already moving toward the exit. The other gladiators stirred but didn't wake. Exhaustion was a constant companion in the ludus, and they'd learned to sleep through minor disturbances. Chase or let it go. The smart choice was clear. Quintus was bigger, stronger, and armed with the desperate fury of someone who'd finally seen his chance at glory. But without the helmet, Marcus was just another piece of meat in the arena. And more than that, the artifact had become his anchor, his only connection to home and the life he'd been torn away from. He followed Quintus through the dark corridors of the ludus, moving as quietly as he could on bare feet. The big gladiator was heading for the arena, probably hoping to claim the helmet's power in the place where it would be strongest. Marcus caught up with him just as he was entering the tunnel system beneath the Colosseum. "Give it back," Marcus called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Quintus turned, the helmet clutched against his chest like a trophy. In the torchlight, his face looked wild, desperate. "I've been fighting for 3 years," he snarled. 3 years of blood and pain and watching lesser men win glory that should have been mine. This is my chance." "It doesn't work that way," Marcus said, edging closer. "The helmet, it's not just about victory. There's something else. Something connected to—" Quintus's roar cut him off, and suddenly the big man was charging, using the helmet like a shield, while his other hand drew a gladius from his belt. Marcus dove aside, rolling across the stone floor as the blade sparked off the wall where his head had been. They fought through the labyrinthine passages beneath the arena, a desperate running battle lit by flickering torches and echoing with the sounds of their breathing and the ring of metal on stone. Quintus had the advantages of size and strength, but Marcus was faster and more familiar with fighting in confined spaces, a skill he'd never imagined he'd need in his suburban New Jersey life. The chase led them up through the beast pens, where the exotic animals destined for tomorrow's games paced in their cages. A tiger snarled as they ran past. Somewhere in the darkness, a lion coughed like thunder. The animal handlers had fled at the first sounds of combat, leaving Marcus and Quintus alone with creatures that could smell blood and fear with predatory accuracy. "You can't escape!" Quintus shouted, his voice ragged with exertion. "I know these tunnels better than you know your own dreams." It was probably true, but Marcus had something Quintus didn't. The helmet's influence, even at a distance, still provided him with flashes of insight, premonitions of danger that kept him one step ahead of his pursuer. When Quintus tried to ambush him in the weapons storage area, Marcus sensed the attack coming and rolled aside just as the gladius punched through the space where he'd been standing. The fight moved into the arena proper, emerging from the hippodrome into the vast oval of sand under the star-filled Roman sky. Without the crowd, the Colosseum felt impossibly large, empty, haunted by the ghosts of all who'd died there. The sand was still dark in places with dried blood from the day's games, and the weapons and shields scattered around the arena's edge gleamed in the moonlight. Quintus had grabbed a shield to go with his sword, making him a formidable opponent even without the helmet's power. Marcus armed himself with a trident and net, the retiarius configuration he'd faced in his first fight, and they began to circle each other on the blood-soaked sand. "Last chance," Quintus called out. "Surrender now and I'll make it quick." Instead of answering, Marcus cast his net, the weighted edges spreading wide as it flew through the air. Quintus knocked it aside with his shield, but it bought Marcus the second he needed to close distance with his trident. They fought under the stars, their battle witnessed only by the marble statues of emperors and gods that looked down from the arena's walls. Quintus was the better swordsman, but Marcus had desperation on his side, and more importantly, he could feel the helmet calling to him, its power growing stronger as violence filled the space around it. The turning point came when Quintus overcommitted to an attack, swinging his gladius in a wide arc that would have taken Marcus's head off if it had connected. Instead, Marcus ducked under the blade and drove his trident forward, its 3 prongs punching through Quintus's shield and into the arm that held it. Quintus screamed and dropped the shield, but instead of pressing his advantage, he threw the helmet as hard as he could toward the far side of the arena. "If I can't have it," he snarled, "then no one can!" The bronze artifact tumbled through the air, catching starlight on its polished surface, and landed in the sand near the arena's eastern wall. Both men ran for it, but Quintus had longer legs and less distance to cover. He reached the helmet first, scooping it up and placing it on his head with a triumphant laugh. "Now," he said, turning to face Marcus with the gladius ready in his good hand, "let's see what victory tastes like." The helmet blazed to life on his head, its bronze surface glowing like a small sun, and Marcus felt his heart sink. Whatever power the artifact possessed, Quintus now commanded it. But something was wrong. Instead of the confident smile Marcus expected, Quintus's face showed confusion, then alarm, then outright terror. The helmet's glow was intensifying, and Marcus could see that it was burning the big gladiator, the bronze somehow heating to unbearable temperatures against his skull. "Get it off!" Quintus screamed, clawing at the helmet with both hands. "Get it off me!" But the artifact wouldn't come free. It had fused itself to his head, and the more he struggled, the brighter it glowed. Marcus could smell burning flesh now, could see smoke rising from where the bronze met skin. "It chooses its bearer," Marcus said softly, remembering what he'd told Quintus earlier. "You can't just take it." Quintus fell to his knees, his screams echoing off the arena walls. The helmet's glow was blinding now, and Marcus had to shield his eyes as he approached the writhing figure. When the light finally faded, Quintus was dead, the helmet resting innocuously in the sand beside his burned corpse. Marcus picked it up carefully, expecting it to be hot, but the bronze was cool to the touch, almost soothing against his palms. He placed it on his head, feeling the familiar weight settle around his temples, and immediately the world shifted into sharper focus. He could sense things, movements in the darkness beyond the arena, the rhythm of sleeping hearts in the ludus, the vast presence of Rome itself sprawling endlessly in all directions. And something else, a pulling sensation, gentle but insistent, tugging at the edges of his consciousness like a tide that was just beginning to turn. The helmet was ready. It had absorbed enough violence, enough blood, enough desperate human emotion to power whatever temporal mechanism had brought him here. All it needed was one more push, One final moment of absolute peril to complete the circuit and carry him home. Above him, torches appeared along the arena's walls as guards responded to the sounds of fighting. Soon they'd be down on the sand, and there would be questions he couldn't answer, suspicions he couldn't allay. He had perhaps minutes before his window of opportunity closed forever. Marcus looked down at Quintus's body, at the peaceful expression death had given him, and felt an unexpected pang of sorrow. The man had been brutal, yes, but he'd also been trapped in the same system that had claimed so many others, slaves, criminals, and conquered peoples, all ground up in the machinery of Roman entertainment. "I'm sorry," he said to the corpse, and meant it. Then he picked up Quintus's fallen gladius and held it to his own throat. The blade was sharp enough to part skin with just the slightest pressure, and a drop of blood ran down his neck as he pressed the edge against his carotid artery. This was the moment the helmet had been waiting for. Not just violence, but the absolute certainty of death, the crystalline instant when life balanced on a razor's edge. The world exploded into light. Reality folded in on itself like origami made of pure energy, and Marcus felt himself pulled through dimensions that had no names, across distances that couldn't be measured in any earthly units. The Colosseum vanished, ancient Rome disappeared, and for a timeless moment he floated in a space between spaces, where the only constants were his own consciousness and the bronze helmet that anchored him to himself. Then the museum floor was solid beneath his feet, and he was standing exactly where he'd been when this impossible journey began, in front of the glass display case, staring at the cracked bronze helmet that looked exactly as it had before, almost exactly. Marcus stumbled backward, his legs suddenly unsteady, and realized he was still wearing the helmet. But even as he watched, it began to change, the bright bronze tarnishing and developing the same green patina and hairline cracks as the museum piece. Within seconds, it was indistinguishable from the artifact in the display case, except that one was in his hands and the other was behind glass. He looked around frantically, expecting to see security guards rushing toward him, but the museum was exactly as he'd left it. Mrs. Davidson was still discussing Roman architecture with a group of students near the front entrance. His classmates were still taking selfies with marble statues. No time seemed to have passed at all, but when he looked down at himself, the evidence of his impossible adventure was written across his body. Sand filled his shoes, not the fine, clean sand of a modern beach, but the coarse, blood-dark sand of an arena floor. His clothes were torn in places he didn't remember tearing them, and beneath the New York Giants hoodie, fresh scars traced the paths where Roman steel had found its mark. Most convincing of all was what he pulled from his pocket, a silver denarius bearing the profile of Emperor Domitian, minted in the year 81 CE according to the inscription around the edge. The coin was real, authentic, valuable enough to fund his college education if he chose to sell it, but he wouldn't sell it, just like he wouldn't tell anyone where he'd been or what he'd seen. Who would believe him? And more importantly, some experiences were too profound to be reduced to mere stories. Marcus carefully placed the helmet he'd brought back into his backpack, then turned away from the display case. As he walked toward the museum exit, he could feel the bronze artifact's weight against his back. Not heavy, but significant, like carrying a piece of history that was also a piece of himself. Outside, the afternoon sun felt different on his skin. Warmer, more precious, laden with the knowledge that each moment of peace was a gift that could be snatched away without warning. He'd lived through humanity at its most brutal and most noble, had seen the courage and cruelty that dwelt side by side in the human heart, and somehow survived to carry that knowledge home. The bus was fixed by the time he rejoined his classmates, and the ride back to school passed in a blur of familiar suburban landscapes that looked impossibly green and clean after the dust and stones of ancient Rome. His friends chattered about the exhibits they'd seen, complained about the length of the trip, made plans for the weekend that stretched ahead of them like an unlimited horizon. Marcus listened to it all with the patient attention of someone who had learned not to take ordinary moments for granted. In his backpack, the bronze helmet rested quietly, its power spent but its presence still comforting. He was home, but he was also forever changed. A modern teenager who carried the memories of a gladiator, a survivor who had learned the true weight of both victory and mercy. That night, alone in his room, he took the helmet out and held it up to the light from his desk lamp, The inscriptions along its crown were visible again, the mysterious symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. But now he thought he understood what they meant, or at least what they represented. They were a promise and a warning, written in a language older than Latin, older than Greek, older perhaps than human civilization itself. They spoke of the doors that existed between moments, the paths that connected all times and places for those brave enough, or foolish enough, to walk them. Marcus placed the helmet carefully in the back of his closet, behind winter clothes that wouldn't be needed for months. Someday, maybe, he'd be ready to wear it again. But for now, he was content to be exactly where and when he was, a 16-year-old boy in 21st century America, with homework to do and a life to live and all the time in the world to figure out who he wanted to become. Outside his window, the suburban night was peaceful and predictable, filled with the gentle sounds of a world that had never known the roar of 50,000 voices calling for blood. But in the darkness of his closet, the bronze helmet waited with infinite patience, holding within its cracked surface the echoes of distant thunder and the promise of adventures yet to come. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The wooden door groaned against Maya's shoulder as she pushed it open, hinges protesting with a rusty screech that echoed through the abandoned saint. Bartholomew's Church. Moonlight filtered through the broken stained glass windows, casting fractured rainbows across the dust-covered pews and rotting floorboards. The air hung thick with decay and something else, something ancient that made the hair on her arm stand on end. "This place gives me the creeps," whispered Jenna, her voice barely audible as she clutched her phone's flashlight with trembling fingers. The white beam danced nervously across the walls, revealing peeling paint and graffiti left by decades of trespassers. "Don't be such a baby," Derek laughed, though his voice cracked slightly. "It's just an old church. Been empty since the 50s. He kicked at a loose floorboard, sending a shower of splinters across the aisle. "My dad said they found some kind of historical stuff in here when they were going to tear it down. That's why they left it standing." Maya stepped deeper into the sanctuary, drawn by something she couldn't name. The altar stood at the far end, draped in shadows that seemed to move independently of their flashlights. Her sneakers squeaked against the warped wood with each step, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. "Look at all this graffiti," said Alex, running his fingers along carved initials and spray-painted tags. "Some of this stuff looks really old, like colonial old." He pointed to a section of wall where someone had scratched what looked like Latin phrases into the wood. "Weird words here. Ignis temporis porta or something." "Probably just some pretentious college kids," Maya replied, but her eyes were fixed on the altar now. Something was wrong with the shadows there. They seemed too deep, too solid. As she approached, her friends' voices faded to a dull murmur behind her. The altar was carved from dark wood, its surface scarred by centuries of use and abandonment. But what caught Maya's attention was the single object that sat in its centre, a thick white candle, maybe 8 inches tall, sitting in a tarnished brass holder. Unlike everything else in the church, it looked untouched by time or decay. The wax was pristine, almost luminous in the dim light. "Guys, look at this," she called, her voice echoing strangely in the space. "This candle looks brand new." Her friends gathered around the altar, their flashlight beams converging on the mysterious object. Up close, they could see that the candle wasn't entirely white. Threads of silver seemed to run through it like veins, and the wick was unusually long and black. "That's impossible," Jenna said, leaning closer. "Everything else in here is covered in dust and grime. How is that thing so clean?" "Maybe someone comes here regularly," suggested Alex. "Like to pray or whatever," Derek snorted. "In this dump. More likely some homeless guy uses it for light." He reached toward the candle, but Maya grabbed his wrist. "Don't touch it." "Why not?" "It's just a candle." But even as he said it, Derek pulled his hand back. Something about the object made him deeply uncomfortable, though he couldn't say why. Maya stared at the candle, transfixed. The silver thread seemed to pulse in the beam of her flashlight, and she could swear she heard something. A faint humming, like electricity running through wires. "There's something written on the base," she said, pointing to the brass holder. Tiny words were engraved around its circumference, but they were too small and tarnished to read clearly. "Come on, let's get out of here," Jenna said, backing away from the altar. "This whole place feels wrong." like we're not supposed to be here. We're not supposed to be anywhere we go, Derek said with a nervous laugh. That's what makes it fun, right? But Maya barely heard them. The humming was getting louder and the silver threads in the candle were definitely moving now, swirling like liquid mercury trapped in wax. Her hand moved toward her pocket, where she kept the lighter she'd stolen from her mum's purse. Maya? Alex's voice seemed to come from very far away. You okay? She pulled out the lighter, its cheap plastic warm in her palm. I want to light it, she said, the words coming from somewhere deep inside her, unbidden. That's probably not a good idea, Jenna said. What if it's some kind of memorial or something? What if someone cares about it? What if it burns the whole place down, added Alex. These old buildings go up like matchsticks. But Maya was already flicking the lighter, the small flame casting dancing shadows on her face. I have to, she said, though she couldn't explain why. The compulsion was overwhelming, like an itch she couldn't scratch. I have to see what happens. Maya, no. Derek reached for her, but it was too late. She touched the flame to the wick and the candle ignited instantly. But this wasn't the warm, gentle glow of ordinary fire. The flame burned white-hot and perfectly still, casting no shadows. The moment it caught, the temperature in the church plummeted. Frost began forming on the windows and their breath misted in the suddenly frigid air. What the hell? Derek started, but his words were cut off by a sound like breaking glass. Cracks appeared in the air itself, spider-webbing out from the candle in all directions. Through the fissures, Maya could see something else. Not the moonlit cemetery outside, but rolling fields under a grey sky. The walls of the church began to shimmer and fade, becoming translucent. The pews dissolved like smoke, and the graffitied walls peeled away in layers, revealing rough stone beneath. The modern world was falling apart around them, replaced by something older and far more sinister. "Run!" shouted Alex, but when Maya tried to move, she found her feet rooted to the floor. The candle was stuck fast in her hand, the flame burning cold against her palm without singeing her skin. Her friends' terrified faces grew distant and warped, as if she was seeing them through water. The humming became a roar, and then everything went black. Maya woke to the sound of hushed voices speaking in accents she didn't recognize. Her head throbbed, and every breath felt like swallowing ice. Slowly she opened her eyes and found herself lying on packed dirt, surrounded by a crowd of people dressed in dark, simple clothing. The women wore white caps over their hair, and the men had wide-brimmed hats and severe expressions. She sat up, confused and disoriented, still clutching the lit candle in her right hand. The flame burned just as it had in the church, white and motionless, casting that strange, shadowless light. But everything else was wrong, terribly wrong. The church was gone. In its place stood a simple wooden meeting house with plain walls and narrow windows. The cemetery outside was smaller, with rough headstones and wooden crosses instead of the elaborate monuments she remembered. The trees were different too, smaller, younger, as if the entire landscape had been rolled back in time. "She bears the devil's light," whispered an elderly woman, pointing at the candle with a gnarled finger. "Look how it burns without consuming itself." Maya looked down at the candle in confusion. The woman was right. Despite burning brightly, the wax showed no signs of melting or shortening. It was exactly the same size as when she'd first lit it. "What? Where am I?" Maya asked, her voice hoarse. The crowd stepped back as if her words themselves were dangerous. "Salem Village," said a stern man with a dark beard, stepping forward from the group. He wore the plain black coat and white collar of a Puritan minister. "And you, child, have much to answer for. Thomas Putnam saw you appear from thin air in the devil's own fire. The whole village witnessed your unholy arrival. Salem Village." Maya's blood went cold. She knew that name from history class, from stories that had given her nightmares as a child. Salem Village, 1692, the witch trials. "That's impossible," she said, struggling to her feet. Several people in the crowd gasped and made the sign of the cross. "I was just in the church with my friends. We were exploring, and I lit this candle and then—" She trailed off, looking around at the faces surrounding her. They were all wrong, too thin, too hard, marked by lives of brutal labour and constant fear. And their clothes, their speech, everything about them screamed of a different century. "Your friends?" The minister's eyes narrowed. "What friends?" You appeared alone in a pillar of flame, wearing the devil's own garments. He gestured at her clothing, jeans, sneakers, and a hoodie that must have looked bizarre and frightening to people who had never seen anything like them. Maya looked down at herself and realised how she must appear to them. Her clothes were made of materials that wouldn't be invented for centuries, cut in styles that would seem indecent and alien to Puritan sensibilities. Her sneakers alone probably looked like the work of demons. "I'm not a witch," she said desperately. "I'm just a girl. A normal girl. I don't know how I got here." "The devil's servants always claim innocence," said a woman in the crowd. "But the evidence speaks for itself. That unholy flame, those strange garments, the way you appeared from nothing. What more proof do we need?" The minister held up his hand for silence. "I am Reverend Samuel Parris," he said solemnly. "By the authority vested in me by the magistrates of this colony, I place you under arrest for the practice of witchcraft and congress with Satan. You will be held until proper examination can be conducted." "No, you don't understand," Maya began, but rough hands seized her arms. The candle remained firmly gripped in her right hand, the flame continuing to burn with that eerie, unchanging light. "The demon fire will not be extinguished," someone called out. "See how it clings to her hand." Maya tried to drop the candle, but found she couldn't. Her fingers were locked around it as if by some invisible force. The brass holder was neither hot nor cold. It simply was, like an extension of her own body. They dragged her through the village streets, past wooden houses with diamond-paned windows and thatched roofs. Curious faces peered out at the procession, and she heard the word "witch" whispered over and over like a poisonous prayer. Children ran alongside, pointing and shouting until their mothers pulled them away. The jail was a stone building that squatted at the edge of the village like a malignant growth. Inside it was dark and damp, with cells barely large enough to lie down in. The jailer, a burly man with missing teeth, shoved Maya into one of the cramped spaces and slammed the iron door shut. "Welcome to hell," he said with a cruel grin before walking away. Maya collapsed onto the straw-covered floor, finally allowing herself to break down. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of elaborate hallucination, maybe caused by inhaling mold spores in the old church. But the cold stone against her back felt undeniably real, as did the stench of unwashed bodies and human waste that permeated the jail. She wasn't alone. The cell across from hers held a young woman about her own age, with lank brown hair and hollow, desperate eyes. In the cell to her left, an elderly man sat hunched against the wall, mumbling prayers in a voice worn raw from screaming. "You're new," said the young woman, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did they accuse you of?" "Witchcraft," Maya replied, then almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "They think I'm a witch because I appeared out of nowhere holding this." She held up the candle, its flame still burning bright and steady. The woman's eyes widened. "Mother of God," she breathed. "That flame, it's been burning this whole time." Maya nodded. "I can't put it out. I can't even let go of it." "Then you really are?" The woman crossed herself and shrank back into the shadows of her cell. "I'm not a witch," Maya snapped. "This is all some kind of mistake. Some kind of impossible accident." The elderly man in the adjacent cell chuckled, a sound devoid of humour. "We all said that at first, girl. But they don't much care about truth here. Only fear." "How long have you been here?" Maya asked. "Months," the woman replied. "I was accused by Abigail Williams herself. She said I sent my spectre to torment her in the night." She laughed bitterly. I'd never seen the girl before in my life, but that matters little. Her word against mine, and she's the niece of Reverend Parris. The old man nodded grimly. "I've been here since spring. My neighbour coveted my land and whispered that he saw me dancing with the devil. Now he tends my crops while I rot in this hole." Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the stone wall surrounding her. These people were going to die. She knew it from her history lessons. Most of the accused would be hanged on Gallows Hill, their bodies left to rot as a warning to others. "There has to be a way out," she said, more to herself than to her fellow prisoners. "There has to be." The old man studied her with sharp, intelligent eyes. "That candle of yours," he said slowly. "There's something otherworldly about it. The flame doesn't flicker, doesn't dance. It burns like it's from somewhere else entirely." Maya looked down at the candle in her hand. He was right. While normal flames would waver and move, this one remained perfectly still, as if painted on the air. "What do you think it means?" My grandmother was from the old country, the man said, lowering his voice. She told stories of ancient magics, of objects that could bridge the gap between worlds. She used to say that fire was the first magic, the one that separated man from beast. And sometimes, if the right words were spoken over the right flame... He trailed off, shaking his head. What words? Maya pressed. I don't remember them all. But she said fire brought things to our world, and fire could send them back. He fixed Maya with an intense stare. Fire brought you here, didn't it? Maya nodded slowly. The moment she'd touched the flame to the wick, reality had shattered around her. Could it be that simple? Could the same fire that had trapped her here also be her way home? But even as the thought occurred to her, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside, heavy boots on stone getting closer. The jailer appeared at her cell door, flanked by 2 magistrates in dark robes. Time for your examination, witch, he said, producing a ring of iron keys. The whole town's gathered to see what the devil's newest servant has to say for herself. They hauled Maya out of the cell and through the streets to the meeting house, the same building she'd mistaken for the abandoned church, but now it was alive with activity, packed with villagers eager to witness the interrogation of the mysterious girl who had appeared in flames. Maya was dragged to the front of the room and forced to stand before a table where 3 stern-faced men sat with quills and parchment. Behind them, Reverend Paris watched with cold, calculating eyes. "State your name for the record," commanded the man in the centre, his voice booming through the cramped space. "Maya?" "Maya Chen," she replied, her voice barely audible. A murmur ran through the crowd. Chen was clearly not a name they recognised, confirming their suspicions about her foreign, possibly demonic origins. "Where do you come from?" the magistrate continued. "Millbrook is about 20 miles north of here." Maya knew it was useless. Millbrook wouldn't be founded for another 100 years, but she had to try. "There is no place called Millbrook in this colony," the magistrate said, making a note on his parchment. "Are you perhaps from the dark realm where Satan holds court?" "No. I'm from the future," Maya said desperately. "I know how insane that sounds, but it's true. That candle, it's some kind of portal or gateway. When I lit it, it brought me here from the year 2023. The crowd erupted in shocked gasps and angry shouts. Someone yelled blasphemer, while another voice called for her immediate execution. The magistrate slammed his gavel down repeatedly until the noise subsided. "You claim to have travelled through time using demonic magic?" "Not demonic. I don't know what kind of magic it is, but it's not evil. I'm not evil. I'm just a 16-year-old girl who made a stupid mistake." 16 and already in league with the devil, Reverend Paris said, shaking his head sadly. "How long have you been practicing the dark arts, child?" "I don't practice anything. I don't know any magic at all." Maya's voice was rising to a hysterical pitch. "This is all just a horrible accident." "Then explain the flame that will not die," the magistrate demanded, pointing at the candle still clutched in her hand. "Explain the strange garments you wear, the foreign words you speak." Maya looked down at the candle, and for the first time since lighting it, she noticed something different. The flame was brighter than before, and the silver threads in the wax were moving more rapidly, swirling in complex patterns like a miniature storm. "I don't know," she whispered. "I just don't know." The examination continued for what felt like hours. They asked her about her family, her home, her education, all things that only reinforced their belief in her supernatural origins. How could she explain cars and computers and cell phones to people who had never seen anything more complex than a water wheel? Finally, the magistrates conferred among themselves in low voices before the lead judge stood to address the crowd. "We have heard enough," he announced. "The evidence is overwhelming. This girl admits to using supernatural means to travel through time itself. She bears an unholy flame that refuses to be extinguished. Her very appearance among us was witnessed by dozens of good Christian folk as a manifestation of diabolic power." The crowd was growing restless, their whispers becoming angry mutters. Maya could feel the mood in the room shifting from fearful curiosity to murderous rage. "We find the accused guilty of witchcraft and congress with Satan," the magistrate continued. "She will be held until dawn, and she will be taken to Gallows Hill and hanged by the neck until dead. May God have mercy on her soul." The crowd exploded into cheers and shouts of approval. Maya felt her legs give out, and only the grip of her guards kept her upright. This couldn't be happening. She was going to die in a world 3 centuries before her birth, executed for crimes she'd never committed. As they dragged her back toward the jail, the crowd followed, their voices raised in a chant that made her blood run cold. "Hang the witch! Hang the witch! Hang the witch!" But then Maya noticed something that made her heart race. The candle in her hand was responding to the chant, its flame growing brighter with each repetition. And carved into the doorframe of the meeting house, barely visible in the flickering light, were the same Latin words Alex had read in the abandoned church. Ignis temporis, porta. Fire, time, portal. The door of time through fire. Maya spent her last night in the cell staring at the candle and trying to remember every detail of what had happened when she'd first lit it. The flame had burned white hot, reality had cracked like glass, and she'd been pulled through to this nightmarish past. The old man in the next cell had been watching her intently. "You figured something out," he said quietly. "I can see it in your face." "Maybe," Maya replied. "Those Latin words you mentioned, did your grandmother ever say ignis temporis porta?" His eyes widened. "Where did you hear that phrase?" "It was carved into the wall of the church where I lit the candle." "What does it mean?" "Fire is the door of time," he whispered. "It was part of the old incantation, the one my grandmother said could open pathways between worlds." But there was more to it. Other words, other conditions that had to be met. What conditions? The old man was quiet for so long that Maya thought he'd fallen asleep. Finally he spoke. The fire had to be lit at a place of power during a moment of great emotion or need, and the one seeking passage had to speak the words with absolute conviction while the flame burned brightest. What were the words? I can only remember fragments. Something about time being a river and fire being the bridge across it. But it has to be said in the old tongue, the language of power. Maya felt tears streaming down her cheeks. Even if she could remember or reconstruct the incantation, what good would it do? She'd be dead by morning, her neck snapped at the end of a rope. Dawn came far too soon. The jailer appeared at her cell with a grim smile, followed by 2 guards and Reverend Paris. "Time to meet your maker, witch," the jailer said, unlocking her cell door. They bound her hands behind her back, though somehow the candle remained fixed in her right palm, its flame still burning steadily, and marched her through the village streets. Word of the execution had spread, and it seemed like the entire population had turned out to watch. Gallows Hill was a low rise at the edge of Salem village, topped by a massive oak tree with a thick branch that extended out over the slope. A rough scaffold had been erected beneath it, complete with a trapdoor and a noose that swayed gently in the morning breeze. Maya was forced up the steps to the platform, where a hooded executioner waited with practised patience. The magistrates read out her crimes once more, their voices carrying across the assembled crowd. When they asked if she had any final words, Maya looked out at the sea of hostile faces and made her decision. She had to try. Even if it killed her, even if it failed, she had to try. "I am not a witch," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I am a daughter of the future, brought here by forces beyond my understanding. But if you must have your blood, then know this. The fire that brought me here will take me home again." The crowd jeered and shouted, but Maya ignored them. She focused on the candle in her bound hands, its flame suddenly blazing brighter than the sun. The Latin words came to her then, not from memory, but from somewhere deeper, as if the candle itself was whispering them in her mind. "Ignis temporis porta," she shouted over the din. "Flammaque mundum dividit duc me domum. Fire that divides worlds, lead me home." The flame roared higher, no longer white, but blazing with all the colours of the spectrum. The crowd stepped back in terror as heat washed over them in waves. The candle was changing, its wax flowing like liquid light while the silver threads expanded into a web of glowing filaments. The executioner moved to put the noose around her neck, but the moment the rope touched her, it burst into flames and crumbled to ash. The wooden platform began to smoke and char beneath her feet. "Stop her!" someone screamed. "The devil is taking his servant!" But it was too late. The fire from the candle was spreading, not destroying, but transforming. Reality wavered like heat shimmer, and through the distortion, Maya could see another world. Her world. The abandoned church, her friends' terrified faces, the familiar shadows of the 21st century. The crowd was in full panic now, running in all directions as the impossible fire spread across the hillside. But Maya barely noticed them. All her attention was focused on the growing portal that was opening in the air around her. With a sound like thunder, the barriers between worlds finally shattered. Maya felt herself falling upward, pulled by forces beyond comprehension as Salem Village dissolved around her like smoke. The last thing she heard was the old man's voice from the jail, somehow carrying across the chaos. "Remember us, child of the future. Remember us, and tell our story." Maya crashed back to consciousness on the cold stone floor of St. Bartholomew's Church. The candle lay beside her, unlit now but still warm to the touch. Her friends were kneeling around her, their faces pale with worry and confusion. "Maya! Oh God, Maya, are you okay?" Jenna was crying, her hands hovering uncertainly over Maya's prone form. "How long was I out?" Maya asked, sitting up slowly. Every muscle in her body ached, and her throat felt raw as if she'd been screaming for hours. "Hours," Derek said, his usual cockiness replaced by genuine concern. "We tried to wake you, but you wouldn't respond. You were, I don't know, somewhere else, talking in your sleep, saying weird stuff about witches and fire." Maya looked around the church, expecting to see some sign of what had happened. Scorch marks, maybe, or evidence of the temporal rift. But everything looked exactly as it had before. The same graffitied walls, the same broken windows, the same dust-covered pews. "We should get you to a hospital," Alex said. "You might have hit your head when you collapsed." "No," Maya said quickly, "I'm fine. Really, I need to go home." They helped her to her feet, and she carefully picked up the candle. It looked ordinary now, just white wax and a blackened wick. But when she turned it over in her hands, her breath caught. The candle had burned down by half, despite never being lit in the present, and there, pressed into the soft wax like a fossil, was the unmistakable shape of a hangman's noose. Her friends saw it too, their faces going pale in the moonlight streaming through the broken windows. "What the hell is that?" Derek whispered. Maya ran her finger over the wax impression, feeling the rough texture of a rope that had existed 3 centuries ago. "A reminder," she said quietly. "A reminder that some stories need to be told." They left the church in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. Maya was the last to leave, pausing at the threshold to look back at the altar where her journey had begun. "I remember," she whispered to the empty air. "I remember all of you." As they walked back through the cemetery toward their cars, Maya pulled out her phone and began typing notes about everything she had experienced. The names of the prisoners, the faces of the accusers, the feel of the rope around her neck, all of it had to be preserved. She'd been given a gift more precious than she could have imagined. The chance to bear witness to history, to carry the stories of the forgotten dead back to the world of the living. Salem Village was gone, erased by time and development, but the people who had lived and died there deserved to be remembered. The candle remained in her backpack as they drove home, its weight a constant reminder of the impossible journey she'd taken. Sometimes, when she wasn't looking directly at it, she could swear the wick glowed faintly in the darkness, as if the fire that had carried her across centuries was still burning somewhere, waiting for the next brave or foolish soul to light it and step through time. Maya never spoke of her experience to her friends or family, but she threw herself into research with a passion that surprised everyone who knew her. She spent hours in the library, poring over historical records and genealogical documents, tracking down the descendants of the people she had met in Salem Village, and late at night, alone in her room, she would hold the candle and feel the weight of their stories in her hands. The old man had been right. She was the child of the future, and she had a responsibility to remember. To tell the truth about Salem, about the fear and madness that had consumed a community and cost so many innocent people their lives. The candle never burned again, but it didn't need to. It had already served its purpose, bridging the gap between past and present, between the living and the dead. And in Maya's careful hands, the stories it had shown her would live on, ensuring that the victims of Salem Village would never be truly forgotten. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind was just right, Maya thought she could hear voices carried on the air, whispers of gratitude from beyond the grave, thanking her for remembering, for caring, for refusing to let their stories die with them. The Salem candle sat on her shelf, a guardian of memories and a keeper of truths too important to be lost to time. And Maya knew that someday, When the moment was right and the need was great enough, it would burn again, carrying another traveller across the impossible distance between what was and what is, adding new chapters to the endless story of human courage in the face of the unknown. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The fluorescent lights of the Metropolitan Museum hummed overhead. As Marcus Chen shuffled along with his 11th grade art history class, their voices echoing off the marble floors. Most of his classmates had already moved on to the next gallery, but something held Marcus transfixed before a massive oil painting titled The Masquerade at Palazzo Medici, 1489. The canvas depicted a grand Renaissance ballroom alive with swirling dancers, their faces hidden behind elaborate masks of silk, feathers, and gold leaf. Candlelight flickered across the painted scene, casting shadows that seemed to dance independently of the figures they belonged to. Mrs. Patterson's voice drifted from the next room, explaining the significance of Byzantine mosaics, but Marcus couldn't tear his gaze away from the painting. The longer he stared, the more details emerged from the rich oils. A woman in emerald silk wore a mask shaped like a peacock, its jewelled eyes seeming to follow him. A man in burgundy velvet bore a golden sun face that appeared to pulse with its own light. But it was the figure in the far corner that truly captivated him. A guest whose silver mask seemed to shimmer and move like liquid mercury, defying the static nature of paint on canvas. Marcus stepped closer, his breath fogging the protective glass. The painting's nameplate read, Artist Unknown. Commissioned to commemorate Lorenzo de' Medici's spring celebration. Note the mysterious figure in the background, whose identity has puzzled historians for centuries. The mysterious figure, the one with the silver mask, appeared to be looking directly at Marcus, despite being painted over 500 years ago. A strange warmth emanated from the canvas, and Marcus could swear he heard something beneath the museum's ambient noise. Music. Faint at first, but growing stronger, the lilting melody of a lute mingling with the deeper tones of a viola da gamba. The scent of beeswax candles and rose water seemed to drift from the painting, replacing the museum's sterile air conditioning. His reflection in the protective glass began to waver, as if the surface were water rather than solid barrier. The candlelight in the painting definitely flickered now. Not the static representation of flame that should have been there, but actual dancing light. Marcus reached out instinctively, his palm pressing against the glass, and the barrier dissolved beneath his touch like morning mist. The music swelled around him, drums and trumpets joining the strings, and suddenly he was falling forward into warm amber light. His sneakers hit marble with a sharp echo that cut through the music like a blade. Marcus stumbled, catching himself against a carved pillar, and looked up to find himself standing in the very ballroom he'd been studying. The painting's flat perspective had become three-dimensional reality. Torches blazed in iron sconces along walls draped with tapestries depicting hunting scenes and heraldic symbols. The air was thick with the scent of exotic spices, fine wines, and human bodies adorned with costly perfumes. Nobles swept past him in a kaleidoscope of colour and motion. Women in gowns of deep jewel tones, sapphire blue, emerald green, ruby red, their hair adorned with pearls and gold thread. Men in doublets of silk and velvet, their legs encased in fitted hose, daggers gleaming at their sides. Every face was hidden behind a mask. Foxes and wolves, angels and demons, suns and moons, creating a garden of beautiful monsters moving in elaborate patterns across the marble floor. Marcus looked down at himself in horror. His jeans, sneakers and museum gift shop t-shirt might as well have been a neon sign announcing his foreignness. Several masked dancers had already noticed him, their conversations pausing as they turned to stare. A woman in a silver gown and swan mask whispered something to her companion, whose bare mask did nothing to hide his suspicious frown. Before panic could fully set in, a figure materialised at Marcus's elbow. A thin man in servant's livery, his face uncovered and bearing the weathered look of someone accustomed to solving problems quickly and quietly. "My lord," the servant whispered urgently, "you're terribly late. The master will have my head if you're not properly attired." Without waiting for a response, he grasped Marcus's arm and guided him toward an alcove hidden behind a tapestry. "I don't understand," Marcus began, but the servant was already pulling items from a wooden chest. A burgundy doublet rich with gold embroidery, black hose, soft leather boots, and a simple black domino mask. No time for explanations, my lord. The Medici are about to announce the evening's entertainment, and all guests must be in their places. The servant's hands moved with practiced efficiency, helping Marcus out of his modern clothes and into the Renaissance finery. The doublet fit surprisingly well, as if tailored for his frame, and the boots, though foreign to his feet accustomed to rubber soles, were comfortable enough. "But I'm not supposed to be here," Marcus protested, even as the servant tied the mask's silk ribbons behind his head. "None of us are supposed to be anywhere, my lord," the servant replied cryptically. "We are all players in someone else's game tonight. Now go quickly, dance, drink, and keep your wits about you. Not all the masks in this room hide friendly faces." Before Marcus could ask what he meant, the servant had melted back into the crowd, leaving him alone among the swirling dancers. The music, now clearly coming from a group of musicians on a raised platform, was unlike anything he'd heard before. The melodies were complex, interweaving like conversation, sometimes playful, sometimes melancholy, always beautiful. Marcus tried to move naturally, to blend in as the servant had advised, but every step felt precarious. He'd seen movies about time travel, read books about people displaced in history, but the reality was overwhelming. The sensory assault of unfamiliar sights, sounds and smells made it difficult to think clearly, and yet, beneath the fear, excitement buzzed in his veins. This was Renaissance Florence, the beating heart of the artistic and intellectual revolution that had shaped the modern world. As he moved through the crowd, fragments of conversation reached his ears. Most was in Italian, which he couldn't understand, but some was in Latin, which his 2 years of high school study allowed him to partially follow. The speakers seemed to be discussing politics, art and philosophy with equal passion. He heard references to Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent, and realised he was witnessing a gathering hosted by one of history's most famous patrons of the arts. But gradually, Marcus began to notice darker undercurrents in the conversations around him. A man in a wolf mask spoke quietly to another guest about the price of loyalty. A woman whose mask bore the face of Medusa mentioned change is coming sooner than expected. Most troubling, several conversations ceased entirely when he approached, as if his presence triggered some kind of wariness. It was while observing these subtle tensions that Marcus first noticed her, the woman in the silver mask. She stood near a marble fountain in the centre of the hall, seemingly alone despite the crowd around her. Her gown was the colour of moonlight on water, and her mask was exactly as it had appeared in the painting, seeming to shift and flow like liquid mercury. Unlike the other guests who moved in the predictable patterns of formal dance, she remained perfectly still, watching. Marcus felt drawn to her, as if by an invisible thread. He began moving through the crowd in her direction, but found his path blocked by other dancers, servants carrying trays of delicacies, and small groups engaged in intense discussion. Every time he thought he'd found a clear route, someone would step into his way, always seemingly by accident, always with a polite excuse. It was during one of these frustrated attempts to reach the silver-masked woman that Marcus overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. Two men in elaborate masks, one depicting a golden sun, the other a blood-red moon, stood near a pillar, their voices low but audible if one listened carefully. "The blade will be blessed at midnight," the sun-masked man said. "When Lorenzo raises the final toast, that will be our signal. And if he doesn't drink from the poisoned cup, then we proceed with the original plan. The Medici line ends tonight, one way or another." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. He was witnessing the planning of an assassination attempt against one of the most important figures of the Renaissance. Lorenzo de' Medici, patron of Michelangelo, protector of learning and art, was supposed to die tonight. But which Lorenzo? The famous Lorenzo the Magnificent had died in 1492, but there were other members of the family. And what year was this supposed to be? Before he could process this information fully, a hand fell on his shoulder. Marcus spun around to find himself face to face with the silver-masked woman. Up close, her mask was even more extraordinary. It seemed to be made of actual silver, but silver that moved and flowed like living water. Her eyes, visible through the mask's openings, were a startling shade of violet that Marcus was certain didn't occur naturally in humans. "You heard them," she said, her voice carrying the faintest trace of an accent he couldn't identify. "The question is, What will you do about it? I don't understand. Who are you? What is this place? She smiled, though he could only see it in her eyes. This place is exactly what it appears to be, a masquerade ball in the Palazzo Medici, spring of 1489. As for who I am... She paused, tilting her head as if considering her answer. I am someone who has been waiting a very long time for you to arrive. For me? But I don't belong here. This is impossible. I was in a museum looking at a painting and somehow you stepped through. Yes, I know. The question is whether you're brave enough to step back through when the time comes, or whether you'll lose yourself in the dream like so many others before you. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Others before me? The woman gestured subtly toward the crowd around them. Look carefully at the faces you can see. Look at the servants, the musicians, the dancers whose masks have slipped. How many of them look like they truly belong to this century? Marcus followed her direction, studying the partially visible faces around him. Now that she'd pointed it out, he could see what she meant. Many of the servants had an oddly modern look about them, straighter teeth than should have been possible before dentistry, skin that looked too healthy for an age before antibiotics, hair that seemed to have been cut with electric clippers rather than scissors. Even some of the nobles, when their masks shifted or slipped, revealed features that seemed somehow anachronistic. They're all from other times, he whispered. The painting is a trap, the woman confirmed. A beautiful, seductive trap that has been drawing people out of their proper times for centuries. Some come from your era, some from earlier periods, some from times yet to come. All are caught by the allure of Renaissance splendour, the promise of witnessing history firsthand. But you're not trapped. No, I am the guardian. The one who ensures that the trap serves its purpose while preventing it from causing too much damage to the flow of time. And you, Marcus Chen of the 21st century, are here because the painting has finally found someone with the will to break the cycle. The sound of his name spoken aloud in this impossible place sent another shock through Marcus's system. How do you know my name? I know many things. I know you've been drawn to Renaissance art since childhood. I know you've always felt like you were born in the wrong century. I know that when you look at paintings of this era, you feel a longing so deep it's almost painful. Her violet eyes seem to pierce straight through him. And I know that unlike the others who have been drawn here, you have the strength to resist the temptation to stay. The music around them shifted to a more urgent tempo, and Marcus noticed the crowd beginning to move in new patterns. At the far end of the hall, a figure in magnificent robes and a simple gold mask had appeared. Clearly someone of great importance, given how the other guests bowed as he passed. Lorenzo, the woman said, following Marcus's gaze, and our time grows short. The conspirators are moving into position. Marcus could indeed see the sun and moon-masked men from earlier, along with several others he now suspected of being part of the plot positioning themselves around the hall. Servants were beginning to circulate with golden cups filled with what looked like wine, but Marcus noticed that certain guests were being offered cups from different trays. We have to warn him, Marcus said. Do we? The woman asked. Consider carefully. If you prevent Lorenzo's assassination tonight, how might that change history? What ripple effects might that create in your own time? Marcus felt torn between his instincts and her words. Everything he'd ever read about time travel emphasized the dangers of changing historical events. But could he really stand by and watch someone be murdered, even someone who had been dead for centuries in his own time? However, the woman continued, this is not actually your history. This is a reflection of history, a shadow cast by the painting's magic. What happens here affects only this pocket of displaced time, not the real flow of events. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. The decision crystallized in Marcus's mind. Real history or not, he couldn't watch an assassination unfold. He began moving toward Lorenzo, but the crowd seemed to actively resist his progress. Every step forward was met with someone stepping into his path, a servant with a tray blocking his way, a group of dancers whose movements prevented him from passing. Meanwhile, the conspirators were moving with purpose. The man in the sun mask had positioned himself near Lorenzo, a goblet in his hand that gleamed with more than just reflected candlelight. The moon-masked man had drawn close to the musicians, and Marcus realized with growing horror that the signal for the attack was about to be given. The mask, the woman's voice reached him over the music and crowd noise. You need the mask. Marcus turned to find her directly behind him, though he hadn't seen her move. In her hands she held a mask unlike any of the others in the room. It was silver like her own, but its surface was perfectly smooth, almost mirror-like, and it seemed to generate its own light. "This mask does not just hide a face," she said, echoing words he remembered from his outline. "It reveals the way home, but more than that, it allows the wearer to move freely through this trapped time, unbound by the constraints that hold the others." Marcus took the mask, surprised by its weight. It felt substantial, real in a way that the rest of this experience somehow didn't. The moment his fingers touched the surface, the sounds around him changed. The music became clearer, the conversations more distinct, and he could suddenly understand the Italian being spoken around him as if it were his native language. More importantly, when he looked around the room, he could see threads of light connecting various figures, golden threads linking those loyal to the Medici, dark red threads binding the conspirators, and silver threads connecting those who, like himself, didn't truly belong to this time and place. "Put it on," the woman urged, "but be warned. Once you wear it, there will be no gradual awakening, no gentle return to your world. When your task here is complete, the transition will be immediate and jarring." Marcus nodded and lifted the mask to his face. The moment it settled into place, the world around him sharpened into crystal clarity. He could see the poison swirling in the wine cup held by the sun-masked conspirator, could hear the whispered countdown of the moon-masked man, could sense the exact moment when the attack would begin. Time seemed to slow as Marcus moved through the crowd. The guests who had been obstacles before now parted before him like water, as if they couldn't quite see him. He reached Lorenzo just as the sun-masked man raised the poisoned goblet in a toast. "To the health and prosperity of the Medici family," the conspirator declared, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet hall. "May they endure forever." Marcus saw the slight emphasis on the word endure, heard the bitter irony in the man's tone, and acted on instinct. As the goblet moved toward Lorenzo's lips, Marcus stepped forward and knocked it from the conspirator's hand. The cup shattered on the marble floor, its contents spreading in a dark stain that seemed to smoke where it touched the stone. Chaos erupted immediately. The conspirators, realizing their plot had been discovered, drew their daggers. Several guests screamed, others began running toward the exits, and the musicians stopped playing with a discordant crash. The sun-masked man lunged at Lorenzo with his blade, but Marcus, still moving with the strange clarity provided by the silver mask, intercepted the attack. The dagger sliced across Marcus's forearm, drawing blood and very real pain, but he managed to grapple with the assassin. Around them, other fights had broken out as the conspiracy unravelled. The moon-masked man was duelling with one of Lorenzo's guards, their swords ringing against each other in the sudden violence. Other conspirators were fleeing or fighting, and the peaceful masquerade had transformed into a battlefield. Marcus had never been in a real fight in his life, let alone a knife fight in Renaissance Italy, but the silver mask seemed to lend him abilities he didn't naturally possess. He could anticipate his opponent's moves, see the telegraphed attacks before they came. When the sun-masked assassin tried to circle around him to get to Lorenzo, Marcus was there first. When the man feinted low and struck high, Marcus had already begun his countermove. The fight couldn't last long. Marcus's borrowed abilities were no match for a trained killer's experience, but it lasted long enough. Lorenzo's guards had finally reached their master and were forming a protective circle around him. Other loyal guests had joined the defence, and the conspirators found themselves outnumbered and outflanked. The sun-masked assassin, realising the attempt had failed, made one final desperate lunge. But instead of targeting Lorenzo, he aimed his blade at Marcus, perhaps recognising that the stranger in the silver mask was the one who had ruined their carefully laid plans. Marcus tried to dodge, but his foot slipped in the spilled wine and poison. He fell backward, the assassin's dagger following him down. Time seemed to slow again, and Marcus saw the blade approaching his heart with perfect, terrible clarity. Then the silver-masked woman was there, moving faster than should have been humanly possible. Her own blade, a stiletto that seemed to be made of the same flowing silver as her mask, intercepted the assassin's dagger just inches from Marcus's chest. The impact sent shock waves through both weapons, and the assassin's blade shattered like glass. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to freeze everyone in the room. The fighting stopped, the screaming ceased, and even the flames in the torches seemed to pause in their flickering. "The game is ended." Marcus looked around and realised that many of the people in the room, guests, servants, even some of the guards, were beginning to fade at the edges, becoming translucent. The elaborate tapestries on the walls were flattening back into painted representations. The three-dimensional reality of the ballroom was slowly reverting to the flat perspective of the museum painting. "It's time to go home," the woman said, helping Marcus to his feet. "All of you." Around the room, the displaced people from various time periods were beginning to move toward the walls, where doorways of light had appeared. Some went reluctantly, looking back at the fading splendour with longing in their eyes. Others seemed relieved, as if awakening from a dream that had become a nightmare. Marcus looked at his arm where the assassin's dagger had cut him. Blood was still flowing from the wound, real and red and painful. "Will this come back with me?" "Proof," the woman said simply. "So that you know it was real, and so that you remember the lesson." "What lesson?" "That the past is beautiful precisely because it is past. That you can appreciate and learn from history without needing to live in it, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is to know when to come home." The ballroom around them was dissolving now, the marble floor becoming flat painted stone, the pillars flattening into brushstrokes. The music was fading back into the museum's ambient hum, and the warm candlelight was being replaced by the cool glow of track lighting. Marcus looked at the silver mask in his hands. It was still solid, still real, still possessed of that strange inner light. "What about this?" "A gift," the woman said, though her own form was beginning to fade along with everything else. "And a responsibility. There are other paintings, other traps, other people who need to find their way home. Perhaps someday you'll understand what that means." The last thing Marcus saw before the transformation completed was the woman's violet eyes, visible through her silver mask, filled with something that might have been pride or hope or gratitude. Then he was standing in front of the museum painting again, gasping and disoriented. His classmates were still in the next gallery, Mrs. Patterson's voice still droning on about Byzantine mosaics. According to the clock on the wall, only minutes had passed since he'd first stopped in front of the painting, but the painting had changed. The mysterious figure in the silver mask, who had been looking out at the viewer, was now turned slightly away, as if watching the other guests. And in the corner where Marcus had seen the sun-masked conspirator, there was now only empty space, as if the figure had simply vanished from the canvas. Marcus looked down at his hands and found the silver mask still there, though it no longer glowed with its own light. In the museum's fluorescent lighting it looked like an antique theatrical prop, valuable, but not magical. His arm still throbbed where the dagger had cut him, and when he rolled up his sleeve he found a bandage that definitely hadn't been there before. "Marcus!" Mrs. Patterson's voice called from the next room. "Come along, we're moving to the sculpture gallery." Marcus took one last look at the painting, then carefully slipped the silver mask into his backpack. As he turned to go, he could have sworn he heard the faint sound of a lute playing somewhere in the distance. But when he paused to listen, there was nothing but the quiet murmur of museum visitors and the hum of climate control. Walking toward the next gallery, Marcus found his mind racing with questions. Had it really happened? Was the cut on his arm and the mask in his backpack proof, or could there be some other explanation? And what had the woman meant about other paintings, other traps, other people who needed to find their way home? He didn't have answers to those questions, and he suspected he might never have complete answers. But as he rejoined his class and tried to focus on Mrs. Patterson's lecture about marble carving techniques, Marcus found himself looking at the other paintings and sculptures with new eyes. How many of them might be more than they appeared? How many contained worlds waiting to be entered, adventures waiting to be lived, dangers waiting to be faced? And more importantly, how many contained people who had stepped through and never found their way back? The silver mask seemed to grow heavier in his backpack, and Marcus began to understand that his adventure in Renaissance Florence might have been just the beginning of something much larger and more complex. The woman had called the mask a gift and a responsibility. Now, walking through galleries filled with art from every period of human history, Marcus was beginning to grasp what that responsibility might entail. The past was indeed beautiful, because it was past, but sometimes people needed help remembering how to come home to their own time. And sometimes it took someone who had been lost and found their way back to help others do the same. Marcus touched the bandage on his arm through his sleeve and smiled. High school had just become a lot more interesting. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy.